Hello, how are you? We're coming up towards the new moon in July 2026. I thought it might be appropriate to do another collective reading and offer some illumination that I can find on my bookshelf. And here is a book, Revolution in the Head by Ian MacDonald, published in the late 90s and revised after the anthology TV series and CDs were released. A book that takes a critical look at the Beatles' career. We live in this weird place now where apparently music criticism is dead, and whatever our veteran heritage musical acts release now is just wonderful, fantastic, and the greatest thing ever. It's interesting how many of these hardcore fans dislike this book because Mr. MacDonald didn't share their glowing views on every single second the Beatles recorded. But this book, uh, the introduction to that I'm going to read, isn't really about the Beatles, and this video isn't about the Beatles. I could make videos talking about my opinion of their career, their personalities, their music. We could debate whether they were uh, for working class cheeky chappies or whether they were the product of Tavistock and cultural Marxism, etc. But I'm not even going to get into any of that either. What interests me is how music contains the expression of a spiritual understanding that isn't really possible in any other art form. And how we only come into contact with it as um, a consumer product and how it overlaps with the ongoing processing of humanity into the future. One in which a large portion of humanity doesn't want to face the fact that our liberal democracy ignores the influence of, how would you say, the influence of social, cultural engineers and architects working on behalf of the 0.1% in creating a all-seeing technocratic eye. And every day I can turn on the phone or laptop and look at the latest bit of atrocity news on Zero Hedge about the latest things coming down the pike in the EU, North America, or Australia, and how there's almost no cultural or political reaction to these things. And we go back nearly 30 years to the publication of this book, which sought to try and make sense of the Beatles' career in doing what almost no other book does, in placing them in the context of the 60s, all the things influencing them, and then their concurrent influence upon the culture, and how we got to hear from, we know we're now going back 60 years, what almost no books about the Beatles or documentaries do now is place them in the context of the 60s. Like the Beatles existed in some kind of vacuum. And it doesn't help to illuminate anything. I mean, in one sense, you could say, what meaning do the Beatles have if you remove them from the 60s? And how they have sort of overwritten history. It's like we remember Beethoven and Mozart, but we don't remember the we remember the Beatles, but do we talk about the Small Faces or Soft Machine or Captain Beefheart or whatever? But going back 30 years, it's interesting to see how much of our current contemporary culture wars are all in motion and, in a sense, predicted. And you could say how little has changed if we draw a line from this book to today. It's just very odd thinking how 30 years have passed. So we're going to read the introduction, which is quite long, and hopefully no copyright holders object, as surely this will only encourage further sales of the book. Anyway, let's get into this, because one can just go off on endless tangents. So we're going to have a look at the preface, and then we'll read the introduction, which is quite long, but I think it's worth doing as something to refer back to, something to spur conversation. And in all videos such as this, what I attempt to do is to draw a map of reality that we find ourselves in. Okay, so we'll look at the preface first. I'll skip through a bit of this. Much as writers preferred their books to appear definitive, there is frustratingly no such thing as the last word. A particularly galling confirmation of this will be published concurrently with the present volume, Miles, Paul McCartney, many years from now. In this book, McCartney speaks about his role in the English underground scene of 1965 to 9, essential background material on the Beatles' music of this period, which previous authors have had to piece together from other sources, guess at. As much as this, he has a lot to say about the Beatles records themselves, some of which Miles has kindly conveyed to me. McCartney also makes a general claim about his partnership with Lennon, which contradicts the impression it left by Lennon in some of his early post-Beatles interviews. Speaking to Rolling Stone in 1970, Lennon described this collaboration as anything from discontinuous to non-existent for most of the Beatles' career. By contrast, McCartney stresses its continuity and professional formality, revealing that during the run-up to recording a new album, he and Lennon would regularly convene for 3-hour writing sessions at the latter's house in Weybridge. In such meetings, they would deploy their new songs, finished or partially written, so that each could check these, suggesting adjustments and helping with sections on which the other had got stuck, such as bridges and middle eighths. McCartney's testimony is a necessary corrective to Lennon's initial version of events, but it should be remembered that the latter revised his story in 1980, conceding that he'd earlier misrepresented the extent to which he and McCartney had cooperated in songwriting. As fundamental as they are for anyone seeking to understand the Lennon-McCartney partnership, McCartney's assertions don't discredit Lennon's claim that one-on-one, eyeball-to-eyeball collaborations or start-to-finish 50-50 co-compositions effectively ceased after their first year or so of their Parlophone contract. Mostly the pair worked by bringing each other's songs either 2/3 done or complete and requiring only fine-tuning or the post-factum approval of the other. McCartney, though, goes further than stressing the professionalism of their partnership, claiming a degree of shared input on several songs hitherto generally accepted as solo pieces, being for the benefit of Mr. Kite. The truth may never be established. Each a self-sufficient writer, McCartney and Lennon saw their working relationship as one of the mutually interested and their happiest mutually enthusiastic business partners. Beginning as more or less separate writers during 1957 to 61, they drifted back into this setup during the last 5 years or so of the Beatles' career, a process marked by increasing rivalry, which by 1965 was causing studio ructions. What remained basic to them was each other's input on material otherwise independently conceived and originated. This could range between a general comment to additional writing amounting to 50-50 co-composition. However, such collaborations were rare, if ever comparable with the intensity of work on such early songs as I Want to Hold Your Hand, in which they competed at the same piano to carry the melody or lyric onto its next section. McCartney further confirms that the Beatles created friction with the main countercultural currents of the 60s. Some reviewers of Revolution in the Head expressed reservations about what they saw as its incongruously intellectual approach to certain areas of the group's discography. McCartney, whose interests have always been omnivorous, is keen to place the latter work of the Beatles in precisely this intellectual context, albeit mediated through the group's innately skeptical humour. The influence of the mid to late 60s English counterculture is clearer in the Beatles' music than in that of any of their rivals. This arose from a conflux of links, beginning with their introduction by Brian Epstein to the film director Richard Lester, continuing with McCartney's friendships with Miles and John Dunbar, and culminating in the meeting of Lennon and Yoko Ono. Through Lester and his associates, who included the Beatles' comedy heroes Spike Milligan and Peter Sellers, the group's consciousness around the time of Sgt. Pepper was permeated by the anarchic English fringe theatre, with its penchant for empire burlesque, example the Alberts, Ivor Cutler, Milligan, and Antrobus's The Bed Sitting Room, which I remember The Bed Sitting Room being repeated late night TV years ago. This atmosphere mingled with contemporary strains from English pop art and beat poetry, the happenings and experimental drama of the People Show, Peter Brook's Company, and Julian Beck's Living Theatre. Their improvised performances of AMM, and what later became the Scratch Orchestra, the avant-garde Euro cinema of Fellini and Antonioni, and the satire at Peter Cook's Establishment Club, and in his TV show with Dudley Moore, not only but also in which Lennon twice appeared. From the cultural watershed of 1965 to 6 onwards, the Beatles' American heroes of the rock and roll 50s gave way to a kaleidoscopic melange of local influences from the English fringe arts and the Anglo-European counterculture, as well as from English folk music and music hall. Although something akin to this cross-cultural soup existed in San Francisco during 1965 to 7, it's difficult to imagine an equivalent American pop group of the period, say the Byrds or the Lovin' Spoonful, opening themselves so hungrily to such highbrow influences. In America, a gulf of distrust exists between instinctual rock and intellectual art, a divide less noticeable in England, where there is no equivalent of the discrete and peripheral category of art rock in America. This is largely due to the English institution of art school, the art schools of which there are specimens in every medium to large town throughout the country, originated from a mid-Victorian campaign to improve the languishing standards of British industrial design. Chiefly a legacy of Sir Henry Cole's Great Exhibition of 1851 and of Albertopolis, the cluster of great museums in South Kensington, close to the Albert Hall. The art school system proliferated across England as a parallel educational structure, becoming a home from home to the gifted but wayward, and often frankly eccentric people with which English life overflows are used to. Art schools and colleges do exist in North America, but bear no resemblance to English ones, being instead institutes of design and technology catering the needs of industry and commerce. The only notable North American musician of the 60s to have attended art school, Alberta, is Joni Mitchell. John Lennon was a classic case of the art school type, an academic misfit who could more or less draw and was otherwise consumed by chaotic creativity in need of channeling. In fact, he did no more serious work at Liverpool Art College than he had at Quarrybank High School. The key to the English art school experience that it was founded on talent rather than on official qualifications. In such an environment, one might interact with a wide spectrum of people regardless of class or education, and draw from a multitude of activities often taking place in the same hall, separated only by screens. In addition to this, the quarterly dances supplemented by more frequent one-nighters as the art schools became incorporated into the UK gig circuit during the 60s, provided opportunities for students to hear the top British R&B and jazz blues groups as well as visiting bluesmen from America. Already a crucible for creative fusion, art school as a result became the secret ingredient in the most imaginative English pop rock. After the affluent 60s, English art schools began to follow other parts of the educational establishment by tightening supervision and examination and moving towards the North American model. Many involved in the punk, new wave, and early 80s pop scene began as art students, but the number of art school crossovers has declined markedly since then. The cutting edge of UK pop culture in the mid-90s is at the commercial nexus of computer music and computer graphics, a fusion of synthesized sound and design on the cusp between pop and advertising. Though he didn't attend Liverpool Art College, McCartney visited it regularly while Lennon was there, absorbing a diverse range of influences, including an interest in painting, which he still pursues. Bill Harry, later editor of the fanzine Merseybeat and author of many books on the Beatles, was also at Liverpool Art College, where he introduced Lennon to his friend Stuart Sutcliffe, with which Harry shared an enthusiasm for Kerouac, the American beat poets, and Europe's existentialists. The Rolling Stones' Charlie Watts likewise went to art school Harrow and still paints, as does Ron Wood Ealing. Keith Richards emerged from the same art school Sidcup as Phil May and Dick Taylor of the Pretty Things. The Pink Floyd Syd Barrett went to Camberwell, while his colleagues Roger Waters and Nick Mason studied architecture at the Regent Street Polytechnic. Drawn from several London art schools, the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band began their career at the RCA. Other 60s pop rock figures who attended art school included The Who's Pete Townsend, Ealing, Ray Davies of the Kinks' Hornsey, Roy Wood of The Move, Mosley, the Yardbirds' Keith Ralph and Eric Clapton, both Kingston, Jeff Beck, Wimbledon, and Jimmy Page, Sutton, Eric Burden and John Steele of The Animals, both Newcastle, Charlie Whitney of Family, Leicester, blues musician John Mayall, Manchester, and Christine Perfect, Birmingham, folk artists John Renborn and Sandy Denny, both Kingston, Thunderclap Newman, Ealing, and Cat Stevens, Hammersmith. Adjacent to the art school world were Steve Marriott of the Small Faces, Mitch Mitchell of the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and Davy Jones of the Monkees, all of whom began in theatre, while David Bowie drew from both fringe theatre and the arts labs, in which areas the soft machine were also involved. The anarchic individualistic art school ethos has brought unusual invention and articulacy to British pop, ensuring that even when its forms cease evolving, it can still ring changes in presentation and interpretation which provide the appearance of something new. With the decline of genuine innovation, this adaptiveness has diverted into more entrepreneurial directions, as with ex Goldsmiths student Malcolm McLaren, or the informal post punk alliance between artists and journalists in the mutually profitable business of conceptualization. Damon Albarn of Blur, there wouldn't have been a Britpop scene if it hadn't been conceptualized and explained, which is a very interesting point. Yet, like almost everything else going on today in pop culture, the roots of these phenomena lie in the 60s. It was the art school background of the Beatles, The Who, The Kinks et al., which allowed them to introduce the concept of concept into pop, along with other postmodern motifs like eclecticism, self referentiality, parody, and pastiche. More than anything else, though, the art school fringe theatre tradition in English pop represents the English love of fantasy and creative artifice, and the concomitant English boredom with authenticity and honesty in art. Outside the realm of public gossip, English popular culture invariably prefers an imaginative contrivance to almost any kind of truth. In this way, England differs fundamentally from America, though English audiences do appreciate soulful realism, particularly in the North, where sensibilities are down to earth. They are also more open than American audiences to artifice and aesthetic adventure, as well as to irony and bleakness. Apart from being conceptual in a way which most American pop rock is not, the pop music made in Britain over the last 30 years, while predominantly gay in the old sense, is also permeated by the wry skepticism of the country's self deprecating humour. An offshore adjunct to this often ruined culture of Europe, Britain, more especially England, is cheerfully inured to failure and decline. As such, the native humour is based mainly on pessimism and self mockery, while the English notoriously derive perverse pleasure from the prospect of disaster, presumably why Keir Starmer was elected. This delight in gloom is intrinsically linked, as one side of a coin to another, to the English love of pretending, dressing up, and being silly, a basic frivolity that embraces a fascination with fakes and frauds, as well as accounting for aspects of English pop music which baffle the more sensible American mind. The result of this mismatch of sensibilities has been a transatlantic translation problem, which has occasioned much amusement on both sides. Just as radio signals bouncing off TV satellites once caused a slight delay between a remark made in London and being heard in New York, so faint pause for interpretation continues to mark exchanges between the users of British English and American English. Not that Americans, as Britons tend to conclude, are without irony, let alone without awareness of the translation problem, which up to a point entertains and intrigues them. The drier kind of American employs irony as naturally as the English. Indeed, the best American comedians are as ironic as it is possible to be without actually vanishing in a corkscrew twist before their audience's eyes, and much admired in Britain for this reason. Yet irony as purveyed in the US media is always circumscribed. Audiences are clearly cued in inferior TV sitcoms by a ponderous archness guaranteed to set English teeth on edge. That irony is imminent and self congratulatory laughter required. While irony is an entirely foreign concept to the weirdly complacent exhibitionists who parade their lives through America's weirdly complacent exhibitionists who parade their lives through America's tabloids and their TV equivalents. If the heroic lachrymose tone of American middlebrow culture, the shining city on the hill, etc., is certain to put a pained smile on the straightest English face, than the bogus bluster and penny dreadful pathos of US evangelism seem to overseas observers excruciatingly primitive. Here, the abyss of mutual incomprehension is huge. The literal mindedness of Middle America is a legacy of the country's historical youth and pioneer Puritanism. Citizens of a can do culture, Americans by and large remain optimistic in their ideals of self betterment, sincerity, and trust. In such a mythos, irony is either signposted with billboard enormity or confined to the smart arse disposition of the intellectual and the outsider. Against those who poke fun, the moral majority will contend that a surfeit of cynical wit goes hand in hand with a dearth of values, that a straightforward attitude gets things done, while an excessive irony is a sign of decadence. There is some truth in this. Conceivably, too much public irony is socially corrosive. Yet postmodern relativism, which rots away old certainties by the day, makes an ironic outlook not so much a la mode as part of the air we breathe. Ideally, the solution would be to balance contemporary skepticism against our forebears' uncomplicated ethic of honest toil and respect for achievement. But since these are opposed outlooks, such a rapprochement seems rather unlikely. While the minority of natural ironists in America rarely misreads the Beatles, this is not the case with mainstream American fans, whose innocence of how completely English culture is pervaded by sardonic indirectness often leads them to take literally statements and lyrics by the group which their English audience would instinctively identify as, at most, half serious. Aside from adducing the more blatant instances of this, the Bible Belt reaction to Lennon's remarks about Jesus and Christianity in 1966, or Manson's fantasies about various lyrics on the White Album, it is hard to summarize a trait which is less an accumulation of cross purposes than a way of life. To British viewers, for example, the New Age piano links on US TV epitomize the mawkish middle American state of mind. By contrast, there is nothing the British loathe more than earnestness. Self solemnity is the primary social faux pas in the UK, and nowhere more than in Northern England. Liverpool being a designated area of outstanding natural sarcasm in this regard. Thus, to take the Beatles too seriously, missing the undertone of irony present even in their terms of the transatlantic translation problem, the rustle of laughter which follows within you without you, is very key indeed. When Harrison visited the hippie capital San Francisco in 1967, he saw not a mass of sincere seekers after enlightenment and social reformation, but a load of horrible, spotty dropout kids on drugs. Serious in his spiritual life, Harrison is nonetheless at heart a sharp-tongued Liverpudlian cynic, a dry sod, as they say on Merseyside, and as such a long-standing debunker of the Beatles myth. Yet in this he is merely the most overtly ironic ex-Beatle, the seemingly more soft-focused Starr and McCartney echoing his wryness when they deem it necessary. It is no coincidence that the only American groups of the late 60s which shared Harrison's derisive view of the US counterculture were steeped in the same highbrow eclecticism as their art school cousins in the UK. Warhol's protégés, the Velvet Underground, and California's nearest equivalents, the Doors, products of the UCLA Film School, Julie became the most influential bands of their era on post-60s English pop rock, while Frank Zappa's eclectic satire won a fanatical fan base in Britain from 1967 onwards. A romantic misconception has grown up among the post 1976 generation that the Doors and the Velvet Underground were neglected in their time and only later discovered by the punks of the mid 70s. This is totally false so far as the UK is concerned. These groups were identified as excitingly distinctive by both the British underground and the student constituency from the moment their first albums arrived as imports. All the interesting musicians of the time were aware of them, and they were formative influences on David Bowie and the artists who went on to form Roxy Music. As such, The Doors and the Velvet Underground were established classics to the journalistic generation of 1972 to 5, and figured highly in critical and readership polls in New Musical Express at the time. The myth of their romantic neglect, which grew up during the 80s, is an historical solecism overdue for debunking. Nor is it coincidental that, though immediately taken up in Europe, neither the Mothers of Invention nor the Velvet Underground ever held much appeal for their home audience. As for the Doors, their American popularity was based less on their intellectual side, their, to English ears, fascinatingly decadent and arty, psychoanalytical and literary illusions. The title, Not to Touch the Earth, Not to See the Sun, taken from the contents list of the Taboo volume of Sir James Frazier's then fashionable anthropological epic, The Golden Bough. Then, on their instinctual aspect, Morrison as erotic rock god and modern pseudo-Dionysus. Not that the odd echoes in the music of these groups and their UK cousins were in themselves substantial, let alone of any intrinsic integrity, merely that they worked in terms of bringing about new forms and neat collisions of old ones. As a result, there is no unambiguous way of judging this intellectual inheritance. Some of what the Beatles said in radio interviews and at press conferences was tosh. Confusingly, the rest was often acute and very funny. In the same way, their use of random, borrowed from the fine art avant-garde, veered from the dazzling to the downright daft. Moreover, far from being belatedly unmasked by the disenchanted 80s, this self-indulgent inconsistency prompted every bit as much backbiting within the 60s highbrow, ironic pop rock elite. Zappa skewered the cod Freudianism of The Doors' The End and satirized the Beatles as industry stooges on We're Only In It For The Money. Recoiling from the artifice of his own 1965 to 6 period, Bob Dylan scoffed at Sgt. Pepper as effete ostentation, while Lou Reed and his colleagues in the New York milieu of Andy Warhol's factory detested everything emanating from San Francisco. Then, as always, originality was a short step from absurdity. What was different about that time was the sense that such distinctions were worth bitching about, that something significant was at stake in what had previously been seen as a trivial and ephemeral idiom. Such was the intensity of the Beatles' cultural context in 1966 to 9 that a certain amount of misinterpretation was guaranteed. Part of the aim of this book is to replace a gushing hero worship with a detached posterity anticipating tally of what the Beatles did. While this entails some deflation and occasionally a little harsh criticism, the hope is also by avoiding cliches in favour of close examination in context to make the group's music as fresh and exciting as it was when it first appeared. Better still, to deepen its meaning and impact for those who may have missed the decade which the Beatles dominated. In general, this stricter focus has been approved by British and European readers. It makes sense to people who live in the Beatles' local culture. However, the Beatles are also part of world culture. More specifically, they are loved with special ardor in the USA, where their early music has its roots. Some of the affection America feels for the Beatles has been expressed in good journalism, although no top stateside rock writer has ever considered them at book length. Probably because the level of pop contrivance and frivolity in their music makes them hard to assimilate into the more earnest and heroic, and often to be fair, more adult American rock culture. Just interject there that it's interesting that when the Beatles break up, you can see Lennon and Harrison are delighted to be free from the pop constraints of the Beatles to make adult music with their first solo albums, and it's one reason why those albums have aged very well. And how, when you listen back to the Beatles, the thing missing is a sense of adulthood and adult topics. How it's nearly all adolescent consciousness. And what Plastic Ono Band and All Things Must Pass do is give you an adult view of the world for the first time. Anyway, much of this flows from the literary cast of mind of such critics, and many of whom originate or identify with the campus coffeehouse folk blues ethos, which mutated by electricity in 1965, continues to ensoul the US rock idiom. These writers expect lyrics to make a certain sense, and if not, to carry significance or responsibility, then at least to have the decency to be authentically rooted in their appropriate subcultural context. The Beatles, though, like so much English pop rock, are too given to artifice and effect to be sociologically grounded in this way. Hence the preference among the more politicized young and 60s America for the blues based and thus supposedly more authentic and so supposedly more radical Rolling Stones. And of course, the Rolling Stones' flirtation with a satanic counterculture underground ended at Altamont, and they then immediately pivoted more towards being entertainment in the form of the greatest rock and roll band. And they began then a long, slow descent into being a corporate entity, which has got us to where we are today with Andrew Watt. Okay. Lennon and McCartney moved from thinking hardly at all about words to treating them as collage scraps to be pasted onto their music, much as Picasso placed newspaper cuttings into his paintings. Few of these lyrics are comparable in style or ambition with the careful verse-like construction of songwriters like Dylan, Lou Reed, Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, Jackson Browne, and others in their inexhaustible line of succession. Aware of the absurdity of solemnly pondering what John and Paul meant by every word they emitted during the course of their hectic career, the smarter American critics have found more suitable subjects for intensive treatment, leaving literal-minded analysis of the Beatles' lyrics to plodders and their music to instrumental magazines or academics bent on transplanting Lennon and McCartney into the alien environment of the 19th century art song. As for the American mainstream audience, in both its published commentaries and fan effusions, the Beatles are worshipped and every fragment of their output treated as sacred, fanatical to a degree that amazes the average British enthusiast. Some American Beatlologists sustain lifetime careers based on minute scrutinies of the work, which can produce anything from reports of all harmonic movements in every song to graphs showing how many times the phrase "yeah, yeah, yeah" was used in Beatles pop, and biblical concordance of the group's lyrics syllable by syllable. Inasmuch as Revolution in the Head voices some non congregational opinions, such pietists would deem it blasphemously iconoclastic. This being so, the author would like to reassure his prospective readers that short of supine adoration, he loves the Beatles' music too. A study of the contrast between American naturalism and English artifice in pop music and life in general would make a fascinating book. A comprehensive history of 60s culture is likewise long overdue, though that will be a gigantic, not to say multi skilled, enterprise. Meanwhile, there's scope for several special area investigations within this period. For example, we await decent accounts of either the British beat group era or the UK 60s counterculture, and lack any histories at all of the English beat or mod movements. New tomes to be scribbled, but not by me, January 1997. And everything he says there is ever more true if you go online to read the fans' reactions and to the deluxe box sets and the insatiable desire for ever more deluxe box sets. In some weird, misplaced desire to recreate the excitement of their childhood and adolescence by the consumption of material products. And that's where criticism has died, because all talk about classic vintage heritage acts is just about how wonderful they are, how wonderful they exist, and how wonderful they still play live. And without music, criticism has totally died now. It's just sort of corporate fandom. Now we move on to the introduction. And the introduction is a fascinating piece of work because it is not about pop music, but about the culture and the cultural war that's been fought over the meaning. And as we move ever further away from the 60s, and as that generation departs their mortal coil, it feels like we understand this psychic battleground less and less, and it's all filtered through conservatism or progressivism. It's very strange. And of course, the other thing which Donovan always likes to remind us, as he was saying the other day, that the Beatles, well, at least three of them, had their Celtic Irish roots. And Liverpool was a place where the Irish went after the famine and continued on into the 20th century. So though we have this experience of European culture, British culture, and American culture, all sort of misunderstanding one another. I mean, even today, it's quite shocking how ordinary European people see themselves as so sophisticated compared to Americans. While Americans have, while really we could learn a lot from each other, Americans have this sort of warmth to them that's lost in a lot of European culture, kind of genuine quality. And at the same time, Europeans are completely blind to how their view of the world is very much an indoctrinated ideology projected upon the world. And then, of course, in between Britain and America is a country called Ireland, which is where I'm from and where I live. And, my parents were of the generation that they went to work in Liverpool in the 60s. My mother was a nurse in Liverpool in the 60s, and all her friends would go and watch the Beatles in the cavern on their lunch break. And I was fascinated to realize this in the 90s when the Beatles anthology TV series was on, and I was asking my parents, what was this all about? And to them, it was just background noise. It didn't really mean anything, and they struggled to have money to pay rents and buy food. Buying an album was still a luxury good in those days for the so-called baby boomers. And that's a huge topic in itself if you look at how you go from generation to generation, from 1900 to 2000. The sort of timeline that can be written out for another video. And in those generations that have followed, from Generation X to Millennial to Gen Z, whatever, you could ask, where do I fall amongst all this? Well, I can only assure you that I was only born yesterday, and I'm merely an innocent bystander in trying to make sense of the world. And this introduction is illuminating in a lot of ways of what has changed since the 90s and what has remained the same as the cultural wars that we used to scoff at as they appeared on the distant horizon are now entangled with all our lives as we live in a globalist culture. And when I used to visit London years ago to go to a concert or a museum or whatever, some cultural totem, I could only imagine how on earth do people live like this? And now, 30 years later, I go into Dublin City and I feel like a stranger, that I could be anywhere in Europe, living amongst a transient globalist population, as the technocrats and architects processing of humanity into their dystopian future ever continues. So let's rewind to the decade of hope, where all things seemed possible and magic was an everyday occurrence. Something, of course, which seems absent in the collective now, but has never gone away for the individual, if you can realize your own magic amongst all the powers seeking to own your soul. Okay, let's get on with this. Introduction: fabled foursome disappearing decade. If you want to know about the 60s, play the music of the Beatles. Aaron Copland. The young make their own fun, whatever time and place they're in. The natural dynamism of youth serving to heighten its surroundings, excited by their own passing blends of music and fashion. Teenagers in every generation since 1955 have believed that theirs was a uniquely special time, yet the 60s were special to an age range far broader than any period before or since. The spirit of that era disseminated itself across generations, suffusing the Western world with a sense of rejuvenating freedom comparable to the joy of being let out of school early on a sunny afternoon. Though ultimately the product of influences deeper than pop, the 60s soaring optimism was ideally expressed by it, and nowhere more perfectly than in the music of the Beatles. Certainly those years would have been similar in tone and direction had they not existed. Yet so vital was the charge emitted by their music, and so vividly did it reflect and illuminate its time, that without it, the irreverently radiant 60s atmosphere, described by Liverpool poet Brian Patton as like a fizzly electrical storm might hardly have sparked at all. So obviously dazzling was the Beatles' achievement, that few have questioned it. Agreement on them is all but universal. They were far and away the best ever pop group, and their music enriched the lives of millions. Yet while the Beatles have passed into the pantheon of permanent regard, the 60s, with which they were intimately linked, are now an ideological battleground upon which there is no agreement at all. Seen as everything from the foundation of modern liberty to the primary cause of present chaos, this carefree age in which nothing was hidden and all caution and modesty were cast to the wind has become the most obscure period of our century, mythologized into a mirage of contradictions, a disappearing decade. Detached from this revaluation, the records of the Beatles and their contemporaries continue to ring out blithely from radio stations, while the period that gave birth to them is fought over in every other niche of the media. But if the Beatles and the 60s are closely related, they must surely have reflected each other's ambiguities. And if they did, how can the group's music evade the charges now being made against the time, which it so perfectly mirrored? One of the earliest repudiators of the 60s was John Lennon. Talking to Rolling Stone in 1970, he dismissing the preceding years of social upheaval and countercultural revolt as little more than a closed show. Everyone dressed up, but nothing changed. To Lennon, then rendered austere by Janov's primal therapy, system created by Dr. Arthur Janov of Los Angeles, in which adult neurosis is ascribed to repressed pain caused by traumatic incidents in childhood. The unhappiness incurred through these primal scenes is released by a confrontational therapy in which the patient admits the primal scream. John Lennon Plastic Ono Band includes many references to this technique, along with the Yoko Ono Plastic Ono Band album released simultaneously. Both the 60s and the Beatles seem to have been divorced from reality. Middle-class daydreams funded on unprecedented affluence and fueled by delusive drugs now insisted the therapized and detoxified ex-Beatles. The dream was over. Sporting dungarees, plimsolls with a purposeful crew cut, he was graphically dressed to clean up the mess. Within a year, he had graduated to revolutionary black leather jacket, beret, and Mao badge. 18 months later, he was seen reeling drunk in a Los Angeles restaurant with a sanitary towel on his head. And so the fashion parade, if that was what it was, went on. The punk rebels of 1976 to 8 saw the 60s in much the same way. Their stripped down, furious music echoing the naked truth aesthetic of Lennon's 1970 primal album, John Lennon Plastic Ono Band. To them, the preceding decade had been a silly self-indulgence, followed by a 6-year hangover of complacent grandiloquence, which had palliated the energy of pop culture. Horrid hippies, the self-styled beautiful people with their vague ideals, and LSD decelerated minds were the problem. Speed, sarcasm, and deliberate ugliness, the solution. Dress code, spiked hair, ripped t-shirt, safety pins through the face. By the early 80s, the 60s had declined into a subject of cynical indifference to the denizens of Margaret Thatcher's deregulated anti-society, simultaneously turning into a standard target of left-wing alternative comedy, reviled from both sides, a figure of futility. The burlesque hippie was an unkempt and pathetic dreamer, body unwashed and mind blown by drugs. Yet at the same time, this object of scorn seemed to be a scapegoat for some obscure sense of loss. It was considered a truism that the 60s had been an empty style display, a concept the 80s had little trouble grasping. But if the ambitions of the 60s generation had really been so irrelevant and impractical, why such a resentment at its supposed failure to realize them? At any rate, the hippies seemed to have got something right. During the second half of the 80s, bored with the mechanical products of so much contemporary pop, a new generation seized on the passionately imaginative music of the 60s, elevating to cult status the records of Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, The Byrds, Led Zeppelin, and the Velvet Underground. The only comparable 80s artist, Prince, digressed into a brief Beatles phase with a pastiche of their LSD period in his album Around the World in a Day. More than a few of his peers admitted that they not only revere the sounds of the 60s, but approved the ideals associated with them. Persisting into the late 80s, this style rehabilitation of the disappearing decade was enthusiastically embraced by the acid house dance idiom of the second summer of love, with its psychedelic fashions, LSD reviving raves, and eclectic sampling of 60s soul classics. A mood-altered mode which has hardly been out of fashion since, owing to the omnipresent influence of sense-amplifying drugs like ecstasy. At the beginning of the 90s, however, the retro voguishness of the 60s temporarily faded as that era came under attack from a right-wing political culture in search of something to blame for the socio-economic chaos it had created in the 80s. Far from failing, claimed these critics, the 60s revolution had succeeded only too well. The rising rates of assault, robbery, drug abuse, divorce, and were all the fault of the permissive society supposedly fomented by left-wing subversives in the 60s. Likewise, the parallel declines in industrial and academic performance, respect for authority, and general attention span. And Mr. MacDonald is talking about the attention span of people in the 1990s. In America, young conservatives accused their parental generation, the baby boomers born in the late 40s, of creating the 90s victim dependency culture of casual violence, trash consumerism, and semi-literate political correctness. 60s anti-institutionalism had, they claimed, wrecked the nation's education system and plundered its social security coffers, leaving a national deficit which today's young will spend their lives paying off, supposing they can find jobs. As for the 60s sexual revolution, it merely produced a flood of pornography and a high divorce, low legitimacy underclass of suddenly unsocialized and unemployable youth. To these critics, everything wrong with modern America was the fault of the irresponsible free lunch hedonists who liberated the Woodstock Festival instead of standing dutifully in line for tickets. Rising to the bait, the boomers launched a counterattack, claiming, au contraire, that most of the civic breakdown in Britain and America after the early 80s was caused by the socially ruinous tax phobia of the right. Reagan, they pointed out, may not have agreed in so many words with Thatcher's claim that there is no such thing as society, but his monetarism said the same in fiscal language. As for Woodstock, it was in venture capital terms indubitably a shambles, yet one untypical of the West Coast counterculture, which during the late 60s and early 70s so successfully operated its own press, merchandising, and distribution networks that right-wing libertarian Frank Zappa felt obliged to remind hippie entrepreneurs that an alternative economy would no more affect structural change than declining to vote. Far from changing the system from within, underground radicals had been disposed to ignore mainstream society altogether and could hardly be blamed for expensive welfare programs which not they, but the orthodox majority voted for, nor could Woodstock, ran the case for the defence, be accounted for within the dully materialistic framework of the 90s. Much of what happened in the 60s had been spiritual in impulse, the free festivals being expressions of a shared feeling intrinsic to the times in which they took place. Moreover, Huge sections of society effectively disenfranchised before the 60s had, as a direct result of the decade's widespread change in attitudes, found their voices and at least a share of social justice. The fact that the debate continues to rumble on is in itself a tribute to the momentousness of the 60s. But if blaming the shameless greed of the Reagan Thatcher era on the sociable and morally concerned we generation is transparently silly, it would be just as fatuous to pretend the 60s did not harbour its own complement of idiots, demagogues, and outright criminals. Haight Ashbury, a quiet bohemian haven till the invention of the hippie movement at the Trips Festival in January 1966, lasted barely 2 more years before degenerating into a methadone heroin ghetto. Few hippie communes survived into the 70s without becoming cults of one kind or another. During the confrontations of 1968 to 70, almost as many freaks willfully provoked the police as were gratuitously brutalized by rioting pigs. Much countercultural rhetoric, notably its airy notion of a money free, share all society, post scarcity anarchism, was adolescent nonsense. Many underground leaders were either sociopaths in love with disruption for its own sake, or self dramatizing opportunists on their way to careers in Wall Street and Madison Avenue. Yet, in spite of all this, the sense then of being on the verge of a breakthrough into a different kind of society was vivid and widely felt. Attitudes formed in this potent atmosphere were lasting. The glimpse of something better, however elusive, permanently changing the outlooks of millions. Why? To understand the 60s, two overriding principles need to be considered. First, what went on then was by no means homogeneous. Many separate trends were working in different phases of development at the same time, much of the decade's contradictory character stemming from unexpected interactions between them. Second, the 60s were a reaction to the 50s, which is to say that passing judgment on the 60s without some idea of what provoked them is tantamount to forbidding them a fair trial. While a strong case can be made for tracing today's falling standards to the 60s anti elitism, it would be as prejudicial to contend that this impulse was without cause as to blame it on any one social group at large in that era. The 50s may have been relatively snug for the generation which had endured the Second World War, but their teenage children saw the period as a stifling drag against which they felt obliged to kick in a desultory way with rock and roll. While theirs was at best a flirtation with freedom, their older siblings, for whom the 50s were a nightmare decade of Cold War paranoia and sinister power without moral legitimacy, posed a more serious challenge to the status quo. In Britain, it was the time of the angry young men. In America, of the Beat Generation. Isolated rebels against social and intellectual restrictions, the angry young men came and went between the Suez fiasco and Macmillan's boom of the late 50s. The Beats, though more than mere heretics of the Eisenhower era, were a real foretaste of a revolutionary future. Often assumed to be a musical reference, the Beat Generation's name in reality referred to a sense of being roughed up by life and flung into the wasteland margins of a materialistic civilization, carrying apocalyptic overtones, the Beat condition, as defined by its leading voice, Jack Kerouac. Other leading Beats, Allen Ginsberg, Gregory Corso, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Neil Cassidy, Alan Watts, Gary Snyder, and Ken Kesey, and then followed in their wake by Robert Anton Wilson. And the word beat can also be seen as a reference to Beatitudes in the Bible. And without a doubt, the reason why the Beatles are called Beatles, they can be considered an allusion to, Buddy Holly and the Crickets, but it seems it was an allusion to the beatniks. Involved a state of being stripped of social insulation and endowed with epiphanic clarity as a result. The mostly middle-class beats were visionary hobos alienated from society, on the road both literally and metaphorically, American cousins of the existentialists whose enigmatic chic drew Lennon and McCartney to Paris in 1961, and in the form of Germany's exes fascinated them in Hamburg. They were less preoccupied with the integrity of the self than with transcending personal limits, reaching out to something beyond the range of everyday experience, since they did not know precisely where they were going. They defined themselves instead by what they were for and against. They were against soul-numbing materialism, moneytheism, for imagination, self-expression, Zen, against society's approved depressants, alcohol, barbiturates, for outlawed stimulants like marijuana, amphetamines, and mescaline, against rationalism, repression, racism, for poetry, free sex, jazz, seeking self-realization through hypnosis and paradox. The Beats were the authentic religious voice of the atomic age. As such, they were formatively influential on the 60s counterculture in California and New York. Their sensibility reaching Britain through the freewheeling vernacular verse of the Liverpool poets. As elsewhere in this introduction, judgments are made from a general rather than a specialist or coteries perspective. The American Beats, for example, began to spawn English beatniks as early as 1959. This influence first felt in the fringe protest movement surrounding CND at the beginning of the 60s, had by mid-1965, with the Holy Communion event at the Albert Hall, spread into the expanding counterculture, but it did not reach the awareness of the general public until Penguin published its best-selling anthology of verse by Adrian Henry, Roger McGough, and Brian Patton in 1967. As late products of the spiritual crisis Western civilization has been undergoing since the inception of the scientific outlook, the Beats were part of a venerable historical succession, the death of God with its commitment loss of both. A moral reference point in our ancient faith in personal immortality began percolating down into society from its origins among rationalist scholars around 400 years ago. As its influence spread, altering every sort of assumption and subtly retuning human relations, science's analytic attitude and technological products came to be perceived as a threat to the realm of the imagination, provoking regular cultural revolts. The late 18th century storm and drying and Gothic movements, the 19th century Romantics and Impressionists, the Symbolists and Surrealists of the 20th century. At the same time, the loss of a transcendent moral index prompted artists to probe the frontiers of personal ethics, rolling back the limits of acceptable behavior and stressing the authenticity of individual experience over dogma handed down from the past or the ruling class. Received wisdom, traditional values and structures, everything that had once given life, form and stability, all were challenged. The Beats were merely another psychic ripple from the rock of materialism dropped into the placid, theocratic pond of the Western mind by the early scientists of the late 16th century, as indeed were the 60s, although Ripple hardly does justice to their convulsive cross-currents of inner and outer unrest. As a rebellion of free essence against the restraints of outmoded form, the 60s began with a flood of youthful energy bursting through the psychic dam of the 50s. Dividing the seamless flow of history into neat 10-year chapters is less arbitrary than some might claim, if only because the human awareness of what year it is has an effect on human behavior and hence on history itself. While millennial panics are the simplest examples of this, something familiar, if less obviously intense, has followed the 10-year calendar cycle for at least the last 2 centuries in Europe. The sense of coming into a new decade encourages an expectation of novelty and renewal, which partially fulfills itself by the mere fact of being present in people's minds. There is naturally disagreement about when the metaphorical 60s started in the UK. Estimates ranging from 1956, rock and roll and Suez, to 1962 to 3, the Beatles' advent coinciding with the onset of a new sexual and political frankness in British public life. The abolition of national service on the last day of 1960 has a claim, although conscription in itself is unlikely to have held back the psychological forces bottled up by the 50s. It is interesting to note, too, how the middle of the decade shows an appropriate halfwayness. The arrival of the English counterculture at the Holy Communion event at the Albert Hall in 1965, the appearance on the world stage of LSD and press attacks on beat music in 1966, the onset of very long hair and colourful clothes for men in 1966 to 7, the cessation around this time of the quaint British ritual of standing to attention in cinemas when the national anthem was played, and so on. And it seems like the 2020s were strangled at their birth, considering what's happened and how pop culture is in this sort of frozen stasis, and how young people seem to be engaged in cosplay by dressing up like TV and movie characters from the 1980s. We're in a very weird time now. But anyway, the driving force of this rebellion resided in the Beatles, in their capacity, then suspected by no one, least of all themselves, as unacknowledged legislators of populist revolt. Born in Liverpool in the early 40s, John Lennon, Richard Starkey, Ringo Starr, Paul McCartney and George Harrison were late arrivals in the first generation of British teenagers, a sociological concept coined around 1930 and later adopted by advertisers in recognition of the then novel spending power of the post-war young. In America, a so-called generation gap had been heralded in the early 50s by J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye and screen stars like Dean and Brando. In Britain, this disjuncture became apparent halfway through the decade with the simultaneous appearance of rock and roll television, Look Back in Anger, and the Suez Crisis, the first crack in the facade of the establishment since 1945. And, seen as the end of the British Empire. Any domestic film of the period will convey the genteel, class-segregated staidness of British society at that time. The braying upper-class voices on newsreels, the odour of unearned privilege in Parliament and the courts, the tired nostalgia for the war, all conspired to breed unrest among the young. Lennon, in particular, loathed the 50s' stiff and pompous soullessness, reveling in the surreal satirical attacks on it by Spike Milligan, Peter Sellers et al. In BBC's radio's The Goon Show. For him, as for the other Beatles, the arrival of Elvis Presley turned the key. Rock and roll was real, everything else was unreal. Yet within 3 years, the Conservatives had been re-elected on the back of Macmillan's Never Had It So Good business boom, while the rock and roll rebellion had collapsed with most of its leading figures hors de combat. Little Richard got religion and forswore the devil's music in 1957. In 1958, Elvis Presley was drafted, staying in the army until 1960. In the same year, Jerry Lee Lewis' career dived after he married a 14-year-old girl. In 1959, Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper were killed in a plane crash, while Chuck Berry was arrested for transporting a minor across a state line. In 1960, Eddie Cochran died in a car crash in which Gene Vincent was badly hurt. Within months, Larry Williams was convicted on a drugs charge. With economic contentment in Britain and America at the turn of the 60s, there seemed no reason to suppose that the youth disquiet of the mid 50s would be resurrected. In the USA, the kids were diverted by cars, beach movies, Bobby Sox heartthrobs, and surf music. In Britain, cheap Vespas and Lambrettas offered youth transport and prestige symbols. Jive halls and espresso bars catered for surplus adolescent energy, and pop idled by on a turnover of skiffle trad and clean faced teen idols mass produced in Denmark Street or imported by quota from America. Prosperity had even lulled the fight out of the angry young men. Former firebrands John Osborne and Arnold Wesker muttering peevishly that there were no great causes left. Yet appearances were deceptive. Beneath the wiped and polished surface of British culture around 1960 lay a festering mess of sexual ignorance, prejudice, and repression, only slightly ameliorated since the 19th century. Erotic experience was mostly confined to the dutiful discontent of marriage, while women were so routinely belittled that they barely noticed it, obediently accepting demeaning fashions and failing to demur with the prevalent male view of blank as something every female secretly wanted. See, for example, The Knack by Richard Lester. In this slow thinking world, as yet unaccelerated by television, gentle neighborliness coexisted with half conscious prejudices against outsiders, Jews, blacks, queers, and complacently censorious ideas of what was proper and decent. National service was still in force, and conformism was universal. Immensely smug, the condescension of the ruling class was reproduced on each social stratum beneath it, all males below one's own level being addressed by their surnames as if the whole country was in the army. Britain was stiff with a psychic tension which was bound sooner or later to explode. Linked with the deferential quietude that tranquilized the UK at the outset of the 60s was an embarrassed uncoordination of mind and body. Even a basic sense of rhythm was rare, as anyone who witnessed TV shows like 6-5 Special and Jukebox Jury will recall. 95% of any audience, which in those days meant whites only, clapped doggedly on the on beat, while the heavy petting and high fiving of today's sportsmen is barely less mechanical. The rigid inhibition of early 60s English cricketers, besides the relaxed naturalness of touring players from the West Indies, was positively comic. Much the same was true of the USA. Arriving there in 1964, the Beatles were amazed to discover how unhip young white Americans were. A generation raised on crew cuts, teeth braces, hot rods, and Coca-Cola knew nothing of blues or R&B and had forgotten the rock and roll which had excited their elder brothers and sisters only 5 years earlier. In this docile context, one of the most powerful currents to animate the 60s was that of black emancipation, embodied politically in Africa's drive to independence and the march of the civil rights movement in America. Its most immediate impact on white culture was made through music, beginning with the blues, rock and roll, and rhythm and blues records, which entering Liverpool via its Harbour City import shops and the US airbase at RAF Burton Wood, otherwise known as Little America, inspired the Beatles. The influences on them of black singers, instrumentalists, songwriters, and producers was, as they never failed to admit in their interviews, fundamental to their early career. Vocal stylings with which white audiences in the USA later heard as foreign, harmonic progressions mistaken by classical critics for Mahler, these were as often as not adapted by Lennon and McCartney from doo-wop discs or Tamla Motown records. Notably, those written and lead sung by William Smokey Robinson, reviving the 50s rock and roll rebellion in the mid 60s with cover versions of records by Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Larry Williams, and the Isley Brothers. The Beatles acted as a major conduit of black energy, style, and feeling into white culture, helping to restore it to its undernourished senses and thereby forwarding the permissive revolution in sexual attitudes. If a black legacy bulked large in the Beatles' heritage, everything that passed through their writing and arranging process was so creatively reshaped that few other artists of any background ever came close to matching them. Though they were embarrassed to perform their rock and roll and R&B covers in America, especially in front of black audiences, their hard seasons in Hamburg's dive bars during 1962 to 62 put enough toughness and attack into their act to place them on an equal footing with any pop music then performed live in the USA. Moreover, they knew exactly how good they were as songwriters, conceding to no one, including their erstwhile American heroes. While their early lyrics were simplistic by the standards of Chuck Berry, Smokey Robinson, Eddie Cochran, Lieber and Stoller, and the teams associated with New York's Brill building, the Beatles far outstripped their rivals in melodic and harmonic invention, baffling seasoned professionals with their surprising chord sequences. More than mere novelty, such breezy unorthodoxy was one of the key characteristics of the 60s. Self made as musicians, Lennon and McCartney had a wry disregard for education and training, shunning technical knowledge in the fear that it would kill their spontaneity and tame them into sounding like everyone else. In this attitude, they were at one with most young British songwriters of the period, the work of Jagger and Richards, Ray Davies, Pete Townsend, Syd Barrett, Roy Wood, and the incredible string band being likewise shaped by a cultivated element of self surprise based on a lack of any ingrained sense of what ought to come next. Like Irving Berlin and Noel Coward, Lennon and McCartney were not only unable to read music, but firmly declined to learn. Pope's principle that a little learning is a dangerous thing applies especially to pop music, where technical expertise tends to produce either songs of lifeless textbook correctness or kitsch exhibitions of decorative pseudo classicism. Invariably, the most original pop songs have been written by artists cleaving to their own private ideas of a musico lyrical design. A forerunner to the Beatles in this respect was Roy Orbison. Without a complete technical training, rare in the pop world, pop writers usually became trapped between knowing too much to be roughly spontaneous and too little for a smooth transcription of their finer ideas, supposing they have any. The only outstanding 60s pop songwriter to have worked from full knowledge without compromising his creativity was Burt Bacharach, who studied under Milhaud, Martineau, and Cowell. Writing to begin with, mainly on guitars, they brought unpredictable twists to their tunes by shifting chord positions in unusual and often random ways and pushing their lines in unexpected directions by harmonizing as they went along in fourths and fifths rather than in conventional thirds. This trait probably at its origins in a background influence of British and Irish folk music filtered through skiffle. See, for example, the droning open fifths of the folk pastiche Babies in Black. In short, they had no preconceptions about the next chord, an openness which they consciously exploited and which played a major role in some of their most commercially successful songs. Example, I Want to Hold Your Hand. Growing up in an atmosphere infused with the hip ideals of the Beats and existentialists, Lennon and McCartney were instinctively biased against squareness in everything from philosophy of life to musical form. Hence the prevalence in their songs of syncopation, half bars, switches and time signatures, sections constructed from odd numbers of bars, and later non-recurring linear layouts. Nor was their sense nor was their sense of form any less personal, manifesting in the irregular phrases and orthodox bar groups which make even the Beatles' earliest work constantly surprising. Knowing that their music's lack of institutional structure was chiefly what made it so alive and authentic, they kept it from becoming stale by continually investigating new methods and concepts, beginning and ending songs in the wrong key, employing modal, pentatonic, and Indian scales, incorporating studio effects and exotic instruments, and shuffling rhythms and idioms with a unique versatility, forever seeking new stimuli. They experimented with everything from tape loops to drugs and chance procedures borrowed from the intellectual avant garde. And as if this was not enough, all three songwriting Beatles had very different ways of composing, which together lent their output an even greater richness and unpredictability. While the group's musical unorthodoxy quickly attracted the attention of classical critics, the latter's failure to spot that Lennon McCartney partnership contained two separate composers was a revealing blunder, if an understandable one. After all, if the idea that one could write and play one's own music was in itself startling in 1962 to 3, the notion that a songwriting team might consist not of a composer and a lyricist, but of two independent writer performers was unheard of. That the Beatles included a third writer performer capable of what Frank Sinatra has called the greatest love song of the last 50 years testifies to their rare depth of talent. In fact, the differences in musical style between Lennon and McCartney were from the beginning quite distinct, reflecting his sedentary, ironic personality. Lennon's melodies tend to move up and down as little as possible, weaving deviously through their harmonies and in chains of repeated notes. Help, tomorrow never knows, I'm only sleeping. Two note oscillations on minimal intervals. I should have known better. A hard day's night. I am the walrus. Are reiterated phrases. I feel fine. Rain. Lucy in the sky. Diamonds. Basically a realist, he instinctively kept his melodies close to the rhythm and cadences of speech, colouring his lyrics with bluesy tone and harmony rather than creating tunes that made striking shapes of their own. McCartney's lines, by contrast, display his extrovert energy and optimism, ranging freely across the stave in scalar steps and wide intervals, often encompassing more than an octave. He is the expression of a natural melodist, a creator of tunes capable of existing apart from their harmony, whereas Lennon's lines tend to be elusive, moody affairs, which make sense only when accompanied, particularly the more chromatic creations of his later style. In other words, while the tunes of both are marked by an unusual incidence of non chordal notes, McCartney's method is in terms of intervals vertical, melodic, consonant, and Lennon's horizontal, harmonic, dissonant. In a less narrowly structural sense, the two represented a classic clash between truth and beauty, seeing music as a vehicle of thought and feeling. Lennon stressed expression at the expense of formal elegance, which held no interest or value for him per se. Intuitive, he cared little for technique and nothing for the rules which he would go out of his way to break. As a result, while sometimes obsessive and crabbed, his music rarely betrays itself and hardly ever strays unintentionally into bad taste. On the other hand, McCartney, by nature drawn to music's formal aspects, yet wholly untutored, produced technically finished work almost entirely by instinct, his harmonic judgment based mainly on perfect pitch and acute pair of ears. However, while his music at its best is the very opposite of inexpressive, he could, entranced by his own fluency, all too easily be distracted from meaning, producing glib prettiness, vapid exercises in style, and excruciating lapses of taste. Example, Maxwell's Silver Hammer. McCartney's sometimes thoughtless flippancy indicates a shallower commitment to feeling than that of his brooding partner, that the shape and surface of life and art interest him more than their depths and contradictions is apparent in his delight in the sound rather than the meaning of words, a facet which became more obvious once the Beatles had broken up and Lennon's sarcasm was no longer there to snap him out of it. Brought together by their common love of rock and roll, Lennon and McCartney were psychologically cemented by the harsh coincidence of losing their mothers in their early teens. But though they never lost their respect for each other's talent, their temperaments and egos soon caused them to diverge as songwriters, displacing genuine 50-50 collaborations. For most of their career, their partnership was a formal arrangement, each writing the lion's share of his own songs before bringing the results to be checked and, where necessary, altered or added to by the other. That said, their close creative proximity generated the electric atmosphere of competitive rivalry, which was the secret of the Beatles' extraordinary ability to better themselves, and where they did collaborate on an equal basis, the results were nearly always remarkable, ascending on the tension between their contrasting personalities and gifts. The Beatles' appearance in 1962-3 coincided with the fall of conservatism in 60s Britain. Caught between its election pledges and a balance of payments crisis, Harold Wilson's Labour government of 1964 was forced to raise income tax, including this swinging rates for high earners, which George Harrison later rallied against in Taxman. Fortunately, buoyancy in the property market, aided by full employment, quickly created a youth-led consumer boom. Spearheaded by the Beatles, the 2-year British invasion of the American top 10 established the UK as a centre of the pop world, with the flowering of talent matched nowhere else before or since. As British pop art and op art became the talk of the gallery world, a new generation of fashion designers, models, and photographers followed Mary Quant's lead in creating the boutique culture of swinging London, to which international filmmakers flocked in the hopes of siphoning off some of the associated excitement into their pictures. Long-standing class barriers collapsed overnight as Northern and Cockney accents penetrated the hitherto exclusively Oxbridge domains of television, advertising, and public relations. Hair lengthened, skirts shortened, and the sun came out over Britain rejuvenated, alert, and determined to have the best of good times. Yet, while changes made itself felt across the board, many of its effects were local or ambiguous. The sexual repression of the past all but vanished from the world of the newly classless metropolitan young. But it took another decade to begin to disappear elsewhere. And while censorship was rolled back, homosexuality legalized, and women given the benefit of the pill and blank on demand, the loosening of over-restrictive divorce laws inevitably created the conditions for the replacement of marriage by relationships in the 70s and a widespread collapse of the nuclear family during the 80s. Immediate sexual gratification became the ideal of a society in which church-going was falling in inverse relationship to the rise in television ownership. As tradition became outmoded and a dispirited Christianity forfeited influence, the public focus began to shift from nostalgia and the compensation of a reward in heaven to an eager stress on the present, combined with an impatient hope for a social heaven on earth in the near future. The emphasis on informal and immediate fun that was the hallmark of swinging Britain during pop's peak years of 1965 to 7 was less evident abroad, particularly in America, where two other socio-cultural movements were unfolding. Inherited from the Beat generation of the late 50s, the first of these took the form of a radical counterculture, which, springing up in opposition to the materialism of mainstream society, arose in California with a special concentration in and around San Francisco. Though framed in terms of sexual liberation and scaffolded by religious ideas imported from the Orient, the central shaft of the counterculture was drugs, and one drug above all, LSD, synthesized in 1938 by a Swiss chemist looking for a cure for a migraine. LSD is a powerful hallucinogen whose function is temporarily to dismiss the brain's neural concierge, leaving the mind to cope as it can with sensory information, which meanwhile enters without prior arrangement. An uncensored experience of reality, which profoundly alters one's outlook on it. Recruited by Dr. Timothy Leary to the existing underground pharmacy of marijuana, mescaline, and magic mushrooms, LSD came to the attention of the mass media in early 1966 when, as state legislators moved to ban it. Allen Ginsberg urged that all healthy Americans over the age of 14 should take at least one trip in order to perceive the new wilderness of machine America as it really was. If there be necessary revolution in America, declared the poet, it will come this way. The LSD view of life took the form of a smiling non-judgmentalism which saw straight thinking, including political opinion across the board, from extreme left to far right, as basically insane. To those enlightened by the drug, all human problems and divisions were issues not of substance but of perception. With LSD, humanity could transcend its primitive state of neurotic irresponsibility and realizing the oneness of all creation. Primitive state of neurotic irresponsibility, a satirical phrase from the script of Jean-Claude Forest Barbarella, as filmed by Roger Vadim in 1967. And really realizing the oneness of all creation proceed directly to utopia. This, however, was not the only utopian prescription on offer. Born from the freedom rides and marches of the civil rights movement, the American New Left offered an alternative route, a neo-socialist moral rearmament crusade aimed at discrediting the system, the power elite perceived as directing the somnambulistic progress of a media-drugged mainstream America, and more specifically, its supposed creation, the Vietnam War. Centered on Students for a Democratic Society, this coalition was campus-based, youth-orientated, deeply idealistic, and highly self-righteous. As such, it had much in common with the burgeoning student protest movements in France and Germany, with their Oedipal revolts against, respectively, the old Communist Party and the post-war conspiracy of silence about Nazism. In each case, the governing motifs were the repressive tolerance of an unfeeling institutional hierarchy without moral mandate as against everything new, young, unprejudiced, experimental, and irresponsible. And at this juncture, of course, the conspiracy theory goes that the hippie movement was created to splinter this movement and dissipate its cultural effects. True, untrue, on we go. Though they competed with each other in the hyper-political New Left and apolitical acid counterculture in America in many ways overlapped, the hippie communes and alternative economy were based partly on the parallel structures ideology of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and partly on the philosophy of the Diggers, an LSD-propelled San Francisco anarchist group which took its name and inspiration from a 17th century English proto-communist movement. At the incessant sit-ins and demonstrations organized in Berkeley during the 60s, it was often impossible to distinguish between these two cultural streams, although the New Left's agitational, confrontational priorities became significantly less fashionable at the peak of LSD's influence in 1966 to 67. Whatever else it was, this multifaceted phenomena was fascinating, tempting hundreds of thousands of young pilgrims to San Francisco to, as Frank Zappa dryly put it, play their bongos in the dirt. Recording Sgt. Pepper at that time, the Beatles were more affected by this ferment than any other British group, McCartney and Harrison each visiting California to make their own evaluation of what was going on. That there was indeed something unusual in the air can still be heard from many of the records of the period. A light, joyous optimism with a tangible spiritual aura and a thrillingly fresh informality. McCartney, drugs, basically. The best example of this is Sgt. Pepper itself, though all who were there at the time will have their nominations for records which distill the spirit of 67. For the present writer, another instance would be the Grateful Dead's bubbling, ecstatic The 11 from Live Dead, which is really the only Grateful Dead album I really enjoy. For some, though, like the satirist Zappa, the urban realistic Velvet Underground and the Doors in their darker songs, this was no more than a fey daydream. Within the ranks of the Beatles, such skepticism was the prerogative of Lennon, whose main 1967 songs, All You Need Is Love and Across the Universe, are unconvincing besides Harrison's philosophical centerpiece for Sgt. Pepper, Within You, Without You, and far less authentically personal than the angry I Am the Walrus or the tragic transcendent A Day in the Life. Paul said, "Come and see the show," Lennon later observed. I said, "I read the news today, oh boy." In this respect, he anticipated the shift from 1967, the year of peace and love, to 1968, the year of the barricades. In fact, so aware was he of the growing confrontation between the counterculture and the establishment that he wrote his polemical Revolution months before Les Evénements of May 68, while in the rarefied air of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi Himalayan retreat at Rishikesh. And it's interesting, I'm the Walrus, when it's talked about online, particularly by the hardcore Beatle fanatics, tends to be seen as humorous nonsense. When I think it has to be heard truly as a psychedelic protest song. Okay. Had he made the pilgrimage to San Francisco in 67, Lennon would no doubt have sensed the counterculture's incipient commercialization and impending decline into hard drugs and written a perceptive song about it. However, he was too engrossed in psychedelic inner exploration to be bothered, self-absorbed at one reach of his personality, self-erasingly utopian at the other. He was a typical LSD user only in his willingness to believe that the drug's effects would inevitably do him good. His perilous brush with identity loss, Tomorrow Never Knows, was brought about not by a single catastrophic bad trip, but through massive overindulgence. Others were less lucky, suffering permanent, even fatal damage. The LSD used in today's dance scene is up to 10 times weaker than the average late 60s dose. And this, of course, written in the 90s. And then we move to today. We now have LSD analogs, which are easily available online, which I think are just as strong or stronger than the 60s. And all the synthetic drugs around now have moved us into a different era of brain damage, one might imagine. Yet for the mass of LSD users, which during the late 60s numbered several millions of the brightest young men and women of their generation, the effects of this potent hallucinogen were more benign, if in the long run nonetheless insidious. The paradox of the so-called love drug was that the universal empathy it created rarely translated into concrete love for another human being, an effect due to the self-negation of the typical LSD experience, in which individuality in itself ceased to seem important. Using it, normal people were able to move directly to the state of oceanic consciousness achieved by a mystic only after years of preparation and many intervening stages of growing self-awareness. as a result of which most of them not unnaturally concluded that reality was a chaos of dancing energies without meaning or purpose. There being no way to evaluate such a phenomenon, all one could do was dig it. Hence, at the heart of the counterculture was a moral vacuum, not God, but the void, enshrined in the motto of Rolling Stone magazine as the cosmic giggle. This implied a world view with neither framework nor stability. Indeed, one contemporary social study notes that 60s hippies actually reveled in ontological insecurity. That is a absolutely fascinating, mind blowing concept to ponder upon. Treating those who sought fixed truths and values with a mischievous irony that their victims were hardly aware of and never understood. Despite this, the hippie outlook, if so heterogeneous a group can be said to have cleaved to one position, was by no means flippant. Theirs was a kaleidoscopically inventive culture actively devoted to the acquisition of self knowledge and promotion of fundamental social change. In rejecting the hippies, the punks of 1976 to 7 discarded only a caricature, coming nowhere near an adequate grasp of what they imagined they were rebelling against. The point of the counterculture is that they were stars at living, the idea of hippie as an aristocrat. Hippie communality was real without being ideological, and many of its concerns, the open attitude to sex, the interest in spirituality, the pioneering focus on ecology, the enthusiasm for alternative technology and medicine, were quickly assimilated to the intelligent fringes of the mainstream. Committed hippies, moreover, soon realized the dangers of drugs. Instead, pursuing their inner quests through Eastern mysticism, their respect for tradition, providing it was older than that of the previous generation, contrasted sharply with the sweeping iconoclasm of their new left rivals, among whom were the punks' own preceptors, the situationists. And punk can be considered in some ways as Malcolm McLaren continuing the situationist revolt of, you say revolt into style of 68. Yet only a small minority of those exposed to LSD went on to follow this lifestyle. For the majority, self-contemplation became self-regard, and merry detachment degenerated into the sort of nihilistic game-playing epitomized by the sordid Discordian philosophy of the Illuminatus trilogy. Sordid, a very interesting way of putting it. Shea and Wilson, 1975, Illuminatus, in which all the cryptic cross references ever to have entranced a drugged mind are melded into one enormous political intrigue, was a passing fancy among survivors of the counterculture during the mid 70s. It is interesting to compare its paranoid conspiracy theory mentality with that of Charles Manson, as documented by Bugliosi and Gentry. And it's interesting, Robert Anton Wilson, his influence still continues on through YouTube videos, and one can only ponder whether he was deliberately employed as an agent of Operation Mind Flip. Anyway, propagated through a haze of drugs and half-baked ideas, what began as flirtation with indeterminism amongst modern artists entered the mainstream via the pop culture of the late 60s. The result was what might be called the rock mentality, a state of mind regularly linked in later decades with irrational murders and suicide pacts, in which urge ousts ethics under the haphazard tutelage of semi-coherent song lyrics. During the late 70s, the smarter pop stars saw the danger of pandering to this outlook and either stopped striking pretentious poses or made sure such posturing was understood as in some way ironic. The slower-witted heavy metal idiom, however, preserved the tradition intact, duly encouraging an endless stream of sinister or tragic obsessions and a Christian fundamentalist backlash. The Beatles made a substantial contribution of their own to amoral meaninglessness with the random lyrics and effects which adorned their later work, just as this backfired on them in the form of the Paul is Dead hysteria and Lennon's death at the hands of a demented fan in 1980. And of course, I don't think anyone can really see that man as being a fan, and certainly there is evidence suggesting he was a patsy in the mold of Sirhan Sirhan. Anyway, so the playful relativism of the Flower Power summer of 1967 produced its own nemesis in 1968 to 9 in the shape of acid crazed extremists like the Mother Flippers, the Manson family, the Molotov cocktail party, and the Weathermen. The sad fact was that LSD could turn its users into anything from florally bedecked peaceniks to gun brandishing urban guerrillas. The most explicit link between acid and anarchistic violence was made by the Weathermen, responsible for thousands of bomb attacks on US institutions between 1969 to 72. They attempted to forestall FBI CIA infiltration by convening meetings in which everyone present took LSD on the principle that no secret policeman could maintain his cover whilst tripping. In 1970, this group, renamed the Weather People in deference to its many zealous female members, liberated acid guru Timothy Leary from a minimum security jail, hailing him as a key figure in the revolution. Buckling on a pistol before fleeing to Algeria, the former prophet of love and peace exhorted what remained of his gullible audience to get off their pious, non-violent asses and free by force all other incarcerated representatives of the once benign alternative society. While the Beatles had nothing directly to do with any of this, Lennon, having set out from a position of skepticism, agreed to write Come Together for Leary's 1969 California election campaign, and later found himself composing a paean to White Panther John Sinclair and inviting the risible Jerry Rubin to play bongos in his pseudo-revolutionary New York group. There was, in truth, little of significance that happened in their time, however foolish or disreputable, which did not almost immediately find its way into the Beatles' life and work. And of course, people will draw a direct line from the Weatherman to the election of Barack Obama, and whether they were always all run by intelligence. And the historical evidence is there that all the terrorism that occurred in Europe, such as the Red Army faction and the Red Brigade, etc., were all actually run by the intelligence agencies. And one can read about Operation Gladio. Okay. Though the late 60s youth rebellion declined into an ugly farce of right-on rhetoric and aimless violence, it would be a gross distortion to pretend that this was not substantially provoked by the stone-faced repressive arrogance of the establishment in those days. The epical trial of the Chicago 8 in 1969 and other comparable judicial travesties in contemporary American Britain. As brutal as the backlash against the civil rights movement, the attack launched on the counterculture by US law enforcement agencies was massive and paramilitary, embracing everything from sabotage and spying to assault and battery. While Abbie Hoffman's yippies bear a large share of the blame for the riot at the Chicago Democratic Convention in August 1968, the violence of the police, as of the state troopers at People's Park in 1969 and Kent State University, Ohio in 1970, was wildly disproportionate and guaranteed if not actually calculated to generate extremism. Nor was this simply a question of blue-collar impatience with the unpatriotic exhibitionism of a crowd of cosseted middle-class kids, simultaneously besieged by blazing black ghettos and a swelling clamour against the Vietnam War. The US government saw the social critique advanced by the counterculture as a direct threat to national security. As such, the hippie New Left amalgam constituted an internal enemy which had to be defeated. Thus, what began as an earnest but peaceful conflict between parental conservatism and youthful idealism gradually degenerated into a head-on clash between a repressive past and an ultra-libertarian future. The axis of this collision was the revolutionary present, the now in which all protest demands were ritually required to be met, the chanting of this magic word at demonstrations more than anything else distinguished the 60s from the 50s and marks the watershed between the precarious instability of the world we live in today and the hollow rigidity of what it sprang from during 1963 to 73. The hippie Oriental maxim, be here now, the Doors, we want the world and we want it now. The ethos of preceding generations had been one of prudent, orderly accumulation, based on budgeting for the future and controlling one's appetite. Essentially, an ethic of scarcity. This way of life sneered at as bourgeois by 60s revolutionaries, but as firmly espoused by the proletariat, began to seem dated as post-war affluence expanded, and youngsters for the first time found themselves with spending money. But while relative wealth may have been the immediate instigator of the now mentality, there was something deeper at work, a reaction against spiritual inertness comparable to that of the Beats and existentialists in the 50s. Much of this, as the Beatles noted in Eleanor Rigby, stemmed from the failure of the church to provide anything more than a weekly social focus for local communities. With its promise of personal immortality, Christianity had for centuries focused its congregations' eyes on the happy future rather than on present injustice. By the 1950s, when the Beatles and their audience were growing up, it seemed clear that religion no longer had any supernatural assumptions. This is quite difficult to read through the camera setup. Okay, where were we? By the 1950s, when the Beatles and their audience were growing up, it seemed clear that the religion no longer had any supernatural collateral to support its claims. The young deduced that their parents' assumptions were obsolete and that since this world was the only one they would ever know, postponing pleasurable self-discovery was pointless. And from today's perspective, it seems that sexual liberation, actually just resulted in the opposite of people chaining themselves to their desires or interpreting desires as liberation when they were actually chains. To constantly desire sex and drugs is not freedom, but confinement, which seems clearer with the 60 years that have passed since. The Beatles' lives and works are prototype models of post-Christian nowness, entirely lacking the uptown urbanity or proverbial worldly wisdom of pre-1963 popular music. Their early lyrics are careless, streetwise, immediate, sensationalistic, the expression of minds without respect for age or experience, interested only in the thrills, desires, and disappointments of the present. Lennon later spoke of this outlook as if it had been derived from LSD, but the imperative to live now, this moment, was central to 60s culture from the outset. Lennon, the whole Beatles message was be here now. Furthermore, the feeling was communicable across generations, being felt by many then in their 30s and 40s. Indeed, the format of modern pop, its fast turnover, high wastage rate, and close link with fads and styles, is intrinsically instantaneous. Few of the Beatles' first 100 records last much longer than 2 minutes, and the musical structure of all of them assumes a rapid cycle repetition absolutely at one, with the jerkily busy production line of the jukebox, compared with the slumberous tranquility of 50s crooners like Perry Como and Michael Holiday. 60s pop was, in the words of The Who's resident cultural analyst Pete Townsend, in a flat spin. Instantaneity defines the pop life and as such saturates the Beatles' music. Their domestic behaviour, filling their drives with multiple Rolls Royces and their houses with expensive junk they never looked at again, is standard among young pop stars and may appear to be no more than a slight acceleration of the nouveau rich syndrome. Yet, as George Martin amusedly observed, the same casual, voracious nowness marked everything they did in the studio too. Lennon rarely bothered to learn any instrument properly, always wanting to move straight to expressing himself. More studious than his partner, McCartney nonetheless showed the same impatience, growing testy if any delay occurred in rigging up the new recording effects he and his colleagues constantly demanded. If an arrangement or an unusual instrument or an entire orchestra was needed, the Beatles expected it to be there immediately. Waiting killed the spontaneity they so prized, taking them back into the patient, postponed, slow world of their parents. Even the long hours of improvisation they indulged in during their later studio career were governed by the same present time mentality. Martin's engineers yawning and glancing glumly at the clock while the group played on and on, lost in their collective perpetual now. While the Beatles' faith in instantaneity produced marvellous, if occasionally monstrous, musical results, it worked less reliably when translated into ordinary speech. The irreverent directness of their early interviews was funny and endearing, precisely because so obviously uncalculated. Unlike previous pop stars programmed to recite their future itineraries and favourite colours, the Beatles replied to the press and in facetious ad-libs provoked by whatever was going on in the immediate present. Yet, when anything more serious came up, their thought processes often portrayed themselves as trite and tangled. Lennon's casually incautious remarks about Jesus and McCartney's careless admission that he regularly took LSD brought howls of righteous anger on their heads, while profligate confusion characterized the entire philosophy of their business creation Apple. When Yoko Ono asked how she would have coped with Hitler, replied that she would have changed his attitude by sleeping with him. The mirth her instant redemptionism provoked among the assembled press stung Lennon into losing his temper, exposing his similarly instant pacifism. The Beatles felt their way through life, acting or expressing first, thinking, if at all, only later. Partly prescribed by the self-mocking Liverpudlian wit, which never lets anyone hog the limelight for long, the scattergun style of Beatles press conferences owed the most to the simple fact that they were a group. Before them, pop acts had been neatly presented as soloists or well-drilled units, each with its clearly identified leader. With their uncanny clone-like similarity and by all talking chattily at once, the Beatles introduced to the cultural lexicon several key 60s motifs in one go: massness, working class informality, cheery street skepticism, and most challenging to the status quo, a simultaneity which subverted conventions of precedence in every way. Briefly a buzzword among Parisian poets and cubists before 1914, simultaneity was revived in the early 60s by Marshall McLuhan in texts hailing society's liberation from the tyranny of print by electronic media, of which the most dominant was and is television, deploring linear thought and fixed points of view, which he saw as sources of conflict and tension in the Western mind. McLuhan welcomed the chaotic flow of media simultaneity, communal exchange, and amplified sensory experience. Little read today, he was a prophet of modern fragmentation, of multi channel TV, multiculturalism, multimedia, multipolar politics, polymorphous sexuality, and the extreme critical relativism of deconstruction. In their characters, collective and individual, the Beatles were perfect McLuhanites. More importantly, their work showed them to be prophets on their own terms, pioneers of a new simultaneous popular art, which we are living in the downstream of. Referring loftily to Lenin in his own right in the House of Commons in 1964, Charles Curran described its author as existing in a pathetic state of near literacy. He seems, sneered Curran, to have picked up bits of Tennyson, Browning, and Robert Louis Stevenson while listening with one ear to the football results on the wireless. As it happened, substituting Lewis Carroll for Tennyson and the Goons for the football results, this was a fairly shrewd summary in Lennon's case. His favourite authors were Robert Louis Stevenson for Treasure Island, Edgar Allan Poe, James Thurber, Edward Lear, Richmal Crompton, Kenneth Grahame, and above all, Lewis Carroll. Setting a style which later spread throughout the younger generation, the Beatles liked to surround themselves with the continuous low-level media babble of loosely scattered newspapers and magazines and permanently murmuring radios and TVs. Apart from the fact that it amused them to live like this, relishing the coincidences and clashes of high and low style that it entailed, they valued simultaneity for its random cross references, which suggested ideas that might otherwise not have occurred to them. Many Beatles songs stemmed from chance meetings between scraps from the day's papers and half attentive toying with bars from songs on the radio. Furthermore, as they grew more confident, they increased this random factor by making regular use of accidental occurrences during recording, such as the radio broadcast of King Lear, fortuitously mixed into the coda of I Am the Walrus, or by deliberately setting up chance-generated musical events, of which the most sustained is Revolution 9, an explicit evocation of modernity's saturated simultaneity of awareness. As records, as distinct from songs, the Beatles' works grew increasingly multifocal, the conventionally dominant lead vocal vying for the listener's ear with disconcerting harmonies, instrumental counter-melodies, backwards tapes, and distracting sound effects. Using the overdub facilities of multi-track recording, they evolved a new way of making records in which pre-planned polyphony was replaced by an unpredictable layering of simultaneous sound information, transformed by signal distortion and further modified during the process of mixing and editing. The same multifocal mentality determined their lyrics, which, starting from barely considered verbal projections of musical moods in their early work, later became largely randomized streams of consciousness cut up and sprinkled into the sensory cauldron of the general sound. Here, the literate, crafted, and consequential ethos of such representatives of erstwhile social stability as Ira Gershwin, Cole Porter, Lorenz Hart, Frank Lusser, Oscar Hammerstein and Noel Coward, was superseded by an elusive maelstrom of fragmentary impressions, perceptions, and jokes, reflecting the collage spirit of an instantaneous, simultaneous, chance embracing new age. Not that the Beatles were fans of formlessness, quite the opposite. Lennon and McCartney had a fine nose for weak points and how to strengthen them, bringing to their work a tight, idiosyncratic sense of structure and a high density of musical incident, bespeaking a habit of detailed listening. Yet even this attentiveness differed from that of the preceding generation, in that its priority was not the song, but the folk technological artifact of the record. What thrilled the Beatles about early rock and roll and rhythm and blues records was the sheer strangeness of the sound they made. And what delighted them, simultaneously cultivating their future creativity, was deciphering how the elements of this words, melody, voices, instruments, arrangement, production worked together. Emerging from this multifocal artistic background, Lennon wrote to create a sound. The words were almost irrelevant. Bob Dylan, who had likewise begun from an adolescent love of rough and ready blues and R&B discs before moving into the more intellectual folk protest idiom, urged Lennon to listen to the words. The latter replied that he couldn't be bothered, that he preferred the sound of it, the overall thing. Like he explained, quoting McLuhan, the medium is the message. And while McCartney established a kind of continuity with earlier generations with his style pastiches and narrative lyrics, he did this chiefly to hold his audience interest by constantly multiplying the Beatles' idiomatic allusions. As their rivals followed suit, pop shifted from a stable medium of social confirmation to a proliferating culture of musical postcards and diary jottings, a cryptic forum for the exchange of individual impressions of accelerating multifocal change. Roger McGuinn of The Byrds recalls the transatlantic camaraderie between pop artists during the mid-60s, a sort of international code going back and forth through records. Fast-moving and devolved, the pop culture of the 60s was intrinsically democratic. Its meaning grounded more in feeling than sense. It represented an upsurge of working class expression into a medium till then mostly handed down to the common man by middle class professionals with little empathy for street culture, leading this democratization of a procession of trained specialists. The Beatles were amused on entering Abbey Road in 1962 to discover it staffed by boffin-like technicians in white lab coats. Attached to this curious scene was a right way of doing things which initially thwarted the accommodation of their sound, but which after 7 years of destruction testing in a dozen Beatle albums had completely changed. A microcosm of the assault on orthodoxy then going on across the cultural spectrum. The Beatles' revolutionizing of the recording studio, prompted by the demands of Lennon's unruly imagination, was masterminded by the more methodically exploratory McCartney in tandem with George Martin and his talented engineers Geoff Emerick and Ken Scott. The only significant aspect of pop the Beatles failed to change was the business itself, acquiring possibly the only honest manager in Britain at the time, certainly the only one to vote Labour. They nevertheless ended their career together on the time-honoured killing field of the contractual dispute. 25 years after them, the commerce in this area continues to move in the traditional direction into the bank accounts of the money men. And for me, I have to interject again here. The biggest mystery and unsolved weirdness of the Beatles' career is why they didn't become a fully independent entity after their original contract with EMI ran out in 1966. They could have become a totally independent group that owned their own music, recording studios, everything. But instead, they re-signed to EMI for another contract which lasted until 1975. And when they launched Apple, it meant Apple could only be run as a kind of vanity label. But Apple could have been completely independent. And why this didn't happen suggests to the paranoid or conspiracy minded is that the Beatles were never truly a free and independent entity. But I'll leave that there. Okay. Of all the manifestations of instantaneity in the 60s, the most obviously hapless was the instant revolution of Euro-Maoism. While change in mid-60s Britain might be symbolised by a jeans-clad photographer driving a Rolls-Royce, the democratic impulse elsewhere was less merrily hedonistic, more seriously political. After the social uprising of the first half of the decade, the Vietnam War incited a moral uprising in the second half, but it was not till Mao Zedong launched his Cultural Revolution in 1966 that the European left found a fate to replace the one shattered by Khrushchev's exposure of Stalin in 1956. The attraction of 1966 vintage Maoist revolution in the age of instantaneity was that it eliminated the preparatory phases of Lenin's model, positing a direct leap to the communist millennium, which would expunge all class distinctions at a stroke. This decided the excited young ideologues of the West amounted to a break with history. All that remained was to take to the streets and tear down the walls. In the heady, simultaneous present-time 60s atmosphere, enthusiasm for Mao's instant revolution spread rapidly on the campuses of France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Britain, and again the Beatles found themselves culturally in the thick of it. For hinting that baiting the establishment with red flags would only spark a backlash, Lenin's revolution was vilified in the left-wing press on both sides of the Atlantic. The radical film director Jean-Luc Godard, fresh from a politically correct portrayal of the Rolling Stones, blasted the Beatles for their apoliticism. An attack which, while it glanced off Lenin, accurately reflected the mood among left activists of the time, egged on by demagogues like Sartre and Foucault, calling for direct action, violence, and people's justice, lynch law. Extremists hijacked the hopeful energy of the 60s, turning it into a rolling riot. While the sun still shone on the almost entirely peaceful outdoor rock festivals, whose era continued for another 5 years, 1968 cast a shadow of pessimism which lengthened during the following decade, leading inevitably to the anger of 1976-8 and the cynicism of the 80s. Student unrest rumbled on in Britain for the rest of the 60s and was eventually replaced by the violent situationism of the Angry Brigade. On the continent, Euro-Maoism persisted into the 70s, crash-helmeted riders periodically taking to the streets in France, and anarchists breaking into gigs and concerts in Germany to liberate them. Finally, turning desperate, it went underground with the kidnappings, bank robberies, and assassinations of Action Direct, the Red Brigade, and the Red Army faction. Still, the doyens of the left approved. Genet supported the Baader-Meinhof gang, while Sartre continued to condone the violence of the Euro-Maoist young. Some diehards even approved of Pol Pot. And as I was saying earlier, the evidence is that the intelligence agencies were involved in all of that as well. Operation Gladio. The student revolts of the late 60s, not only in Western Europe, but in Czechoslovakia, America, and Japan, were surprisingly quickly forgotten. By 1972, the campuses had settled down, and student revolution time as the Beach Boys had serenaded it, was so much a thing of the past that it was possible to attend universities in the mid-70s without knowing it had happened. At its height, this tumult divided America against itself more violently than at any time since the Civil War, and came within a whisker of sweeping the French government out of office. which also in retrospect could be seen as an American derived colour revolution. Yet its actual achievements were meagre. A few curriculum changes and some minor additions to civil rights legislation. Though the revolutionary left's call for self-rule and participatory democracy were timely, its venerable class war ideology was an anachronism even in 1968. Instead, the real legacy of the 60s democratic impulse was handed down from sources rooted in that era. The civil rights movement, black emancipation and multiculturalism, the hippies, environmental and health pressure groups, and the permissive society, feminism and gay liberation. Essentially populist, the 60s were also essentially non-ideological, socially reformative rather than politically revolutionary. As such, the events of 1968 were a kind of street theatre acted out by middle-class radicals, too addled by theory to see that the real 60s revolution was taking place not in the realms of institutional power, but in the minds of ordinary people. The masses whom activists had been taught to regard as inert material to be moulded to their ends turned out to be impervious to crude attempts to raise their consciousness or pretentious happenings designed to reveal their true desires. They knew their desires quite well already and were getting on with satisfying them. The true revolution of the 60s, more powerful and decisive for Western society than any of its external byproducts, was an inner one of feeling and assumption, a revolution in the head. Few were unaffected by this, and as a result of it, the world changed more thoroughly than it could ever have done under merely political direction. It was a revolution of and in the common man, a revolution, as Aaron Copland, author of the eponymous fanfare, observed, whose manifesto, its vices, as much as its virtues, its losses as well as its gains, its confusions together with its lucidities, is readable nowhere more vividly than in the Beatles records. In effect, the generation gap which opened in the 50s turned out not to be a quarrel between a particular set of parents and children, but an historical chasm between one way of life and another. After the 60s, references to the generation gap lapsed largely because few were any longer aware of such a thing. Indeed, it would have seemed reasonable at the time to have assumed that the lesion had miraculously closed up and healed. Yet what actually was that a new way of life so persuasively and pervasively replaced an earlier one that the majority made the mental crossing between them without really noticing it, much as Britain passed from imperial to decimal coinage around the same time. And it has to be added, isn't it strange how there's so much in contemporary culture about generation gaps and how much the young are encouraged to hate their elders as we continue our processing into a technocratic panopticon where you will live only in the now and own nothing. Okay. A transitional period, the 60s witnessed a shift from a society weakly held together by a decaying faith to a rapidly desocializing massive groups and individuals united by little more than a wish for a quick satisfaction. From a sheltered assumption of consensus, hierarchy, and fixed values to an era of multiplying viewpoints and jealously leveled standards, from a naive world of patient deferral and measurable progress to a greedy simultaneity of soundbite news and thought-bite politics, from an empty and frustrating moral formality to an underachieving sensationalism. What playwright and A Hard Day's Night screenwriter Alan Owen has called the divine right of the establishment was definitively punctured in that decade, and while the establishment itself survived, its grandly complacent delusion of immunity did not. 30 years later, the conservative political culture of the West democratized from below and harried by a contemptuous media, is riven by factions and rotten with corruption. Yet, ironically, orthodox socialism, the secular face of humanism, appears equally obsolete in the face of the multifocal chaos of modern selfishness. The truth is that the 60s inaugurated a post religious age in which neither Jesus nor Marx is of interest to a society now functioning mostly below the level of the rational mind in an emotional, physical dimension of personal appetite and private insecurity. While most of the populace in a developed countries still believes in the soul and its post-mortem salvation, religion in the old sense, a supra mundane outlook standardized by monolithic sacred institutions, has largely been replaced by subjective individual beliefs in a personal God, in angels, or in a general transcendentalism based on near death experiences. Christianity has fissured into a multiplicity of churches and sects, some of which consist of a handful of people. This tendency is most extreme in America, where polls consistently show a majority claiming some sort of Christian or religious belief. Compared to the religions of the past, these claims are, at best, to a form of convenience faith, passive, sentimental, often indistinguishable from patriotism, and to be picked up or laid aside according to the awkwardness of the moral predicaments confronting it. A self excusing relativism formed in the image of the hypocrisy of many American evangelical leaders. By the standards of Islamic fundamentalism, the average American's claim to faith is flimsy. While faced with its own fundamentalists at elections, America as a whole continues to endorse secular values as we now experience a wave of Islamic colonialism in the West. Okay. These contradictions were unresolved in the 60s, it being chiefly the clash between them which sparked the electricity millions then felt in the air, symbolized by Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones. The revolt of youth against institutional authority was at first less obvious in the Beatles because suppressed by Brian Epstein in the interests of popular appeal. Packaged for family consumption, the Beatles nonetheless felt as nonconformist as their colleagues, and after breaking Epstein's benign hold over them in 1966, they began, in uncertain terms, to speak their minds. Lennon and Harrison were the main dissidents, Lennon in particular angry in the belief that the Beatles had become embourgeoised initially by the conventions of showbiz and later by the fantasy world of LSD. A temperamental socialist who voted conservative to guard his money, he embodied all the tensions and contradictions inherent in the transitional 60s, and as such was a shrewd choice by Desmond Morris as man of the decade. At the point at which the Beatles took control of their destiny, coinciding with the simultaneous appearance of LSD in the counterculture, right-wing papers began predicting the demise of the beat groups and attacking the alleged worship of youth and novelty among their Fleet Street rivals. In the Neo-Philiacs, the Christian writer Christopher Booker saw what was happening as a mass hysteria based on a vitality fantasy, describing the youth uprising and its leaders, the Beatles, as a manifestation of evil. Based on an eccentric Spenglerian system of historical cycles, the Neo-Philiacs was written too close to the events it sought to explain to see that, far from fizzling out as its author and most of the upmarket press assumed, they were about to take on a new intensity. As for the Beatles, rather than played out, they were on the verge not only of their best work, but of adding to it a philosophical dimension, wholly defying Booker's analysis. Since middle-class Christians tend to conceive a spiritual crisis as something which happens only to conscientious individuals and in the best of Anglican good taste, and certainly not to the accompaniment of electric guitars, it was hard for Booker or Malcolm Muggeridge or Mary Whitehouse to understand that much of what appeared to be profane in 60s youth culture was quite the opposite. Writing 3 years later, a more open minded Christian, Kenneth Leach, was able to grasp the late 60s for what they were, a spiritual crisis en masse. Far from appearing out of thin air in the 60s, as many conservatives now like to believe, the decade's mass transition from sacred to secular represented a climactic stage in the historical rise of science. Over recent centuries, the Christian glue which once cemented Western society had been progressively weakened by the shocks of scientific discovery, the most catastrophic being the realizations that not only is the earth neither the center of creation nor 4,000 years old, but that humanity is physically descended from the apes, which I don't agree with. I think the apes are a failed evolutionary line. You can laugh at this, but it's clear as day there is no missing link. Anyway, with the arrival of the 20th century, the technological spin-offs of the scientific outlook became increasingly forceful in their social impact. During the 1914-18 war, the old order was brought close to collapse by the devastating invention of the machine gun, surviving the disillusionment of the 20s only because their 60s-like tastes for novelty, promiscuity, and drugs were too much the indulgence of a privileged few to pose a general threat to stability. In the 60s, however, socially liberating post-war affluence conspired with a cocktail of scientific innovations too potent to resist. TV, satellite communications, affordable private transport, amplified music, chemical contraception, LSD, and the nuclear bomb. For ordinary people, the true movers and shakers of the 60s, these factors produced a restless sense of urgency, heavily combined with unprecedented opportunities for individual freedom. Abandoning a Christian world of postponed pleasure for hungry secularism fed by technological conveniences. They effectively traded a hierarchical social unity in which each knew his place for the personal rewards of a modern meritocracy, which has been shockingly transformed into technocracy, where you will have no more rights than the serf. And one can understand this period of time as just being a period of time. It's very strange. Anyway, the mass shift to individualistic materialism came into full swing as the Beatles appeared, and the records they made in their early career reflect its mood with unself-conscious elation. Good time music, simple and feeling with the accent on physical excitement. At the same time, as if shadowing the rise of the new secularism, society's intake of consciousness-depressing drugs grew so rapidly that when consciousness-enhancing drugs like marijuana and LSD appeared around 1965 to 6, the contrast was inescapable. Advocated in America by former Beats like Ginsberg and Ken Kesey, psychedelic drugs exposed modernity's spiritual emptiness, challenging the unexamined life of the consumer society. The resulting acid counterculture of the mid-60s was both a mass attempt to transcend the self in the absence of God and an echo of the 19th century romantics' use of opium to release the imagination from the tiresome constraints of rationalism. Switching from mainstream drugs to countercultural drugs, and in doing so, rejecting the naive materialism implicit in their early style, the Beatles made quality of awareness the overriding topic of their work from Revolver onwards. Writing about this 10 years later, Lennon described his own and his generation's so-called drug abuse as a struggle to break out of the straitjacket of the mind to reach out there. For him, the cultural continuity with artistic revolts in earlier periods and with driven individuals like Van Gogh and Dylan Thomas was obvious. The sky and celestial imagery in songs of this period, Lennon offering one notable case study, Jimi Hendrix another, dramatizes this generational yearning for a spiritual life beyond the banality of the material one. A parallel impulse was at work in contemporary jazz with the simultaneous, instantaneous, free collective improvisation of the new thing. Sun Ra, John Coltrane, Albert Ayler, and Pharoah Sanders were all transcendental artists searching for pure expression, unshackled by the rational intellect. As the externalized conscience of mainstream society, the counterculture soon came into conflict with the surviving class stratified conservative religious mentality of the 50s, vying with it for the soul of consumerdom. Happy to be consumers, ordinary people remained unmoved by this battle, instead getting on with enjoying their new world of convenience and independence. During 1967, all they noticed of this consciousness war being waged over their heads was that certain hippies and pop stars were being made examples of by being busted for possessing drugs, and that the Beatles were, as the Queen quaintly put it, getting awfully strange these days. With the establishment fighting back hard in 1968, another element was provoked into play, the revolutionary anarcho-communism of the New Left. Yet while riots and bombs were hard to ignore, the great mass of society was no more taken with the student radicals than it had been with the restrained grey 50s or the multicoloured hippies. Resisting these various pitches for social consensus, the mainstream continued with its acquisitive individualism, buying Beatles records for their tunes and tolerantly ignoring their lyrics. Thus, by a devilish paradox, those who thought they were at the cutting edge of social development in the 60s, the hippies, the New Left, soon found themselves adrift in the wake of the real social avant-garde of the period, ordinary people. The individualism of the me decade, as Tom Wolfe dubbed the 70s, was a creation of the 60s mass mainstream, not of the peripheral groups which challenged it. Former hippies and radicals who abandoned the utopian we for rueful self-interest in the 70s, far from leading public taste, were merely tagging along behind it. As for the punks, their blurt of betrayal in 1976-8 was apprehended by the comfortable, sensible majority of Western society with no more than mystified amusement. The irony of modern right-wing antipathy to the 60s is that this much misunderstood decade was in all but the most superficial senses the creation of the very people who voted for Thatcher and Reagan in the 80s. It is, to put it mildly, curious to hear Thatcherites condemn a decade in which ordinary folk for the first time aspired to individual self-determination and a life of material security within an economy of high employment and low inflation. The social fragmentation of the 90s, which rightly alarms conservatives, was created neither by the hippies who wanted us to be together, nor by the New Left radicals, all of whom were socialists of some description. So far as anything in the 60s can be blamed for the demise of the compound entity of society, it was the natural desire of the masses to lead easier, pleasanter lives, own their own homes, follow their own fancies, and as far as possible, move out of the communal collective completely. Short of a swing to quasi-fascist populism, the mid-90s clamour for a moral revival based on humanitarianism will remain empty for as long as we continue to value community less than we value privacy. The success of CCTV and zero tolerance policing suggests that a major change is on the way, although it is unclear whether this will lead to a genuine communitarian revival or is merely the prelude to a segregation of society into have and have-nots, areas enforced by vigilante law. Again, written in the 90s. The truth is that once the obsolete Christian compact of the 50s had broken down, there was nothing apart from, in the last resort, money holding Western civilization together. Indeed, the very labour-saving domestic appliances launched onto the market by the 60s consumer boom speeded the meltdown of communality by allowing people to function in a private world, segregated from each other by TVs, telephones, hi-fi systems, washing machines, and home cookers. The popularity in the 80s of the answering machine, the phone call you don't have to reply to, is another sign of ongoing de-socialization by gadgetry. It is, in short, no accident that Miss Thatcher should have founded her outlook on the conviction that society does not exist, and no surprise that her favourite 60s tune is Telstar by the Tornadoes, a record symbolising the rise of technology-driven post-war prosperity and mass social emancipation. She and her radicalized post-consensus conservative voters are the true heirs of the 60s. They changed the world, not the hippies, and certainly not the new left. What mass society unconsciously began in the 60s, Thatcher and Reagan raised to the level of ideology in the 80s. The complete materialistic individualization and total fragmentation of Western society. Which is now coming into contact with the colonization by people who aren't fragmented and in the privacy of their minds still live in a medieval consciousness. Hoist with its own petard, the new right now seeks to pin the blame for the unhappier aspects of the 60s social revolution on groups whose influence on the course of events over the past quarter of a century has been at best peripheral, at worst non-existent. While female, gay, and racial liberation have agitated against the status quo, none of these movements is pro-consensus, or except at their extremes, utopian. Pressure groups promoting issues specific to themselves, women, gays, and blacks, have been as much at war with the left as with the right, having less in common with socialist factionalism than with the upwardly mobile constituency that elected the Conservatives and the Republicans in the 80s. The logic of their drive for self-determination predicts less social unity, not more, as given the chances of any special interest minority imposing a totalitarian rule in the West, does the otherwise liberal language of political correctness. But from this 90s perspective, you couldn't have imagined or predicted pride parades and drag time story hour in your local library. Okay, almost as destructive, the facile psychobabble disseminated via post-Freudian quick cure therapies stems not from the utopian selflessness of the hippies or New Left, but from the navel gazing of the 70s and the shameless self-love of the 80s. The right-wing lineage of modern empowering cults, from Ayn Rand to Scientology, is self-proclaimed, while the most popular brand of Buddhism in the West exhorts its adherents to chant for Porsches. As for the clearly leftist philosophy of deconstruction, its cynical egalitarianism has done great damage to the old cultural consensus of the West, demolishing respect for tradition and authority with nihilistic relish. A malignant rot has spread through the Western mind since the mid-70s, the virus of meaninglessness. Yet this infection threatens all ideologies, left or right, being at root no more than a levelling crusade on behalf of the aesthetically deprived, a bad taste liberation front. The reason why cultural relativism has caught on is not because ordinary people read Derrida, but because the trickle-down essence of deconstruction suits both the trash aesthetic of media hounds and the philistinism of Essex man. The same goes for the wider post 60s social effects recently lamented by politicians on the lookout for votes, the slackening of parental control and educational standards, and the associated decline in areas of achievement less concrete than the pursuits of wealth, health, physical beauty, and sporting excellence are too pervasive and run too deep in the modern world to be blamed on a conspiracy of utopian baby boomers. Leaving aside the Philistine nature of contemporary conservatism, the anti elitism of the 60s, far from restricted to the counterculture, was intrinsic to the democratic spirit of the age. As such, the popular rebellion against authority was well underway before the arrival in 1966 of its would be hippie anarchist leaders, persisting in the background while the flower children and Maoists enjoyed their Orwellian 15 minutes of fame. The 60s anti authoritarian mood of cheeky undeceivability continued to make way for the quiet inner revolution of attitude and assumption within whose consequences, propitious and otherwise, we live today. Again, most of the work of this revolution was inspired and facilitated by the productions of science. It is, for example, difficult to contemplate a labour saving device without thinking somewhat less of traditional virtues like application and persistence, which lead to people using AI to write their essays in third level institutions. A culture of convenience is inevitably a culture of laziness, and in this respect, the role of television in turning humanity into a passive audience has been agonized over by social analysts of all persuasions, yet the passivity of the TV experience is precisely what we enjoy about it. Indeed, television, with its inbuilt sensationalistic bias and pathetic discontinuities, and now for something completely different, as Monty Python said, has been more influential in advancing the post 60s revolution in the head than any other technological innovation. Another culturally symbolic gadget from the 80s is the TV remote control, which allows us to watch in a simultaneous state of mind, channel hopping so as to preclude sequential thought, whilst decreasing emotional purchase on the material thus idly scanned. Pop music, too, has played a role in reinforcing the manifest relaxation of goals and standards since the 60s, aside from the inescapable fact that this relaxation was to various degrees willed by the majority. Pop and its shatteringly sensationalistic cousins, rock, disco, and rave music, have been as much colonized by technology as any other area of modern life. Its once flexible human rhythms replaced by the mass production regularity of the drum machine, its structures corporatized by the factory ethic of the sequencer, its vitality digitized to death and buried in multi-layered syntheticism. Pop is now little more than a soundtrack for physical jerks, and we don't even have to go to the trouble of making it now with the AI. Interviewed about his reading habits, a leading pop dissident of the 80s, Mark E. Smith, castigated the illiterate shallowness of much of his audience. Kids' brains nowadays are like sludge. It's the machines. I've seen it change in 10 years. They're not thinking or listening anymore, obsessed with technology. Video games is just an elaborate fruit machine. While the instantaneous, simultaneous mentality introduced by the 60s suited new idioms like pop and television, mainly because substantially created by them, it had a less benign effect on older established forms. Classical music, once an art of expression, became a pseudo-scientific, quasi-architectural craft of technique whose principles of design, opaque to the ear, were appreciable only by examining the blueprint of the score. Similarly, the rapid succession of conceptual coups in the world of painting and sculpture, so novel at the time, turned out to be merely the end of modernism, and as such, the dying fall of Western art. Overtaken by the artistic discourse of postmodernism, art became as literary as post-Webnerian classical music was visual, producing the arid paradox of paintings to listen to and music to look at, as Brian Eno fulfilled. Shorn of their content, art, music, and literature degenerated by increasingly inconsequential stages from art to jokes about art, and finally to jokes about art. The shift during the 60s from a convergent literate narrative moral culture to a divergent visual structural relativism can be discerned in the various elements of the chronology. Pure surface, the screen prints, instant paintings of Warhol gave way, as if by design, to the empty, hyper-realist, airbrushed perfection of the 70s ad mass graphic style. Equally pure surface, the minimalism, organised underachievement of Philip Glass and Steve Reich, moved smoothly from avant-garde status in the 60s to soundtrack big business in the 80s, while jazz fled the smouldering multifocal wreckage of the instantaneous, simultaneous new thing to commercial sanctuary in the machine art of jazz funk, there to tick over as efficiently as any other assembly line. The crucial thing that died with the rise of the instantaneous, simultaneous outlook was development of theme and idea, of feeling and thought, of story and character. Just as post-religious life has seen a rapid dwindling of interest in the process of growing older and wiser, so art has drifted up to the surface, forsaking progress for process, consequence for multifocal chaos, meaning for maximum impact, thus paralleling the general expectation of multiple orgasms instilled by the proliferating sex industry. The cinema has created the multi-climactic film in which narrative sense and dramatic structure are sacrificed to a sequence of sensationalistic shocks, a soullessly carnal genre appealing to the lowest common denominators in human nature, erotic titillation and the childish love of being thrilled or horrified. Where linear development lingers on in the film world, it does so mainly in limply ironic form, typified by the designedly meaningless drift of the road movie. The root of contemporary intellectual scorn for narrative, apart from the enjoyment of despising precisely what ordinary people enjoy most, a good story, is post-religious egoism. Confessedly self-centered, Lennon mocked McCartney's novelist songs, contending that artistic authenticity could be achieved only by writing about oneself. If, as lyrico-musical unities, his songs clearly cut deeper than McCartney's, they are ultimately as idiosyncratic as those of Dylan. Shallow as much of his work is, McCartney, facing candidly out into the world, repeatedly achieves the trick of matching popular appeal with quality of expression. If the difference between talent and genius in tune writing lies in the degree to which a melody, more than merely catching the ear, tells an emotional story, he is beyond doubt an intermittent musical genius. By the same token, the depressing decline in his melodic gift since the breakup of the Beatles is the product of a deflation of feeling once his life outside the group lapsed into comfortable normality. Losing their expressive force, his tunes, while as crafted as ever, have become emotionally bland, while his music as a whole has lost the crucial element of habit transcending surprise. This, though, has happened sooner or later to every artist working in pop. Lennon, whose music was always more expressive than tuneful, managed to sustain his creative vitality only a little longer than his partner. The ultimate root of this degenerative trait lies in the psychological change introduced into Western life during 1963 to 73, the revolution in the head, which the Beatles played a large part in advancing, and whose manifesto runs willy-nilly through their work, rendering it not only an outstanding repository of popular art, but a cultural document of permanent significance. The destabilizing social and psychological evolution witnessed since the 60s stems chiefly from the success of affluence and technology in realizing the desires of ordinary people. The countercultural elements usually blamed for this were, in fact, resisting an endemic process of disintegration with its roots in scientific materialism. Far from adding to this fragmentation, they aimed to replace it with a new social order based on either love and peace or a vague anarchistic European version of revolutionary Maoism. When contemporary right-wing pundits attack the 60s, they identify a momentous overall development, but ascribe it to the very forces who most strongly reacted against it. The counterculture was less an agent of chaos than a marginal commentary, a passing attempt to propose alternatives to a waning civilization. Ironically, the harshest critics of the 60s are its most direct beneficiaries, the political voices of materialistic individualism. Their recent contribution to the accelerated social breakdown inaugurated around 1963, economic Darwinism wrapped in self-contradictory socio-cultural prejudices, hasn't helped matters. Yet even the new right can't be held responsible for the multifocal and fragmented techno decadence into which the first world is currently sinking, as if into a babbling, twinkling, micro-electronically pulsing quicksand. During the 90s, the fashion was to reprove others for our own faults. Yet even if we take the blame for ignoring our limitations and eroding our own norms over the last 30 years, it is hard to imagine much short of fascism or a second coming that will put Humpty back together again. The 60s seem like a golden age to us because relative to now, they were, at their heart, the countercultural revolt against acquisitive selfishness, and in particular the hippies' unfashionable perception that we can change the world only by changing ourselves, looks in retrospect like a last gasp of the Western soul. Now radically disunited, we live dominated by and addicted to gadgets, our raison d'etre and sense of community unfixably broken, while remnants of our once stable core of religious faith survive. Few are very edifying. Till hard drugs are legalized, the old world will retain some moral hold on us. But when they are, as the dictates of vulgar pragmatism predict, the last ties will be cut with our former way of life, far away from us on the other side of the sun-flooded chasm of the 60s, where, courtesy of scientific technology, the Beatles can still be heard singing their buoyant, poignant, hopeful, love advocating songs. 1997. And what we see now are the tech bros convincing us the solution for us to fully accept and enter their brave new world is that we're microdosed at all times.